Chapter 11. Gravity out of bed. It is probable that Sir Archibald Roylance did not altogether believe Dickson's tale. It may be that he considered him an agreeable romancer, or a little mad, or no more than a relief to the tedium of a wet Sunday morning. But his incredulity did not survive one glance at Saskia as she stood in that bleak drawing-room among Victorian water, colours and faded chintzes. The young man's boyishness deserted him. He stopped short in his tracks, and made a profound and awkward bow. "I am at your service, mademoiselle," he said, amazed at himself. The words seemed to have come out of a confused memory of plays and novels. She inclined her head a little on one side, and looked towards Dickson. "Sir Archibald's going to do his best for us," said that squire of dames. "I was telling him that we had had our breakfast." "Let's get out of this sepulchre," said their host, who was recovering himself. "There's a roasting fire in my den. Of course you'll have something to eat, hot coffee. Anyhow, I've trained my cook to make coffee like a Frenchwoman. The housekeeper will take charge of you, if you want to tidy up, and you must excuse our ramshackle ways, please. I don't believe there's ever been a lady in this house before, you know." He led her to the smoking room and ensconced her in the great chair by the fire. Smilingly she refused a series of offers which ranged from a sheepskin mantle which he had got in the Palmers and which he thought might fit her, to hot whiskey and water as a specific against a chill. But she accepted a pair of slippers and deftly kicked off the brogues provided by Mrs. Moran. Also, while Dickson started rapaciously on a second breakfast, she allowed him to pour her out a cup of coffee. "You're a soldier?" she asked. 2 years infantry, 5th Battalion Lennox Highlanders, and then Flying Corps. Top the whole time I had to, till the day before the armistice when my luck gave out and I took a nasty toss. Consequently I'm not as fast on my legs now as I'd like to be." "You were a friend of Captain Kennedy?" "His oldest. We were at the same private school, and he was at Tutors, and we were never much separated till he went abroad to cram for the diplomatic and I started east to shoot things. Then I will tell you what I told Captain Kennedy." Saskia, looking into the heart of the peats, began the story of which we have already heard a version, but she told it differently, for she was telling it to one who more or less belonged to her own world. She mentioned names at which the other nodded. She spoke of a certain Paul Abreskov. "I heard of him at Bokhara in 1912, said Sir Archie, and his face grew solemn. Sometimes she lapsed into French, and her hearer's brow wrinkled, but he appeared to follow. When she had finished he drew a long breath. "My aunt? What a time you've been through. I've seen pluck in my day, but yours? It's not thinkable. Do you mind if I ask a question, Princess? Bolshevism we know all about, and I admit Trotsky and his friends are a pretty effective push, but how on earth have they got a world-wide graft going in the time so that they can stretch their net to an out-of-the-way spot like this? It looks as if they had struck a Napoleon somewhere." "You do not understand," she said. "I cannot make anyone understand except a Russian. My country has been broken to pieces, and there is no law in it, therefore it is a nursery of crime. So would England be, or France, if you had suffered the same misfortunes. My people are not wickeder than others, but for the moment they are sick and have no strength. As for the government of the Bolsheviki it matters little, for it will pass. Some parts of it may remain, but it is a government of the sick and fevered, and cannot endure in health. Lenin may be a good man, I do not think so, but I do not know, but if he were an archangel he could not alter things. Russia is mortally sick and therefore all evil is unchained, and the criminals have no one to check them. There is crime everywhere in the world, and the unfettered crime in Russia is so powerful that it stretches its hand to crime throughout the globe, and there is a great mobilizing everywhere of wicked men. Once you boasted that law was international and that the police in one land worked with the police of all others. To the day that is true about criminals. After a war evil passions are loosed, and, since Russia is broken, in her they can make their headquarters. It is not Bolshevism, the theory, You need fear, for that is a weak and dying thing. It is crime, which to a day finds its seat in my country, but is not only Russian. It has no fatherland. It is as old as human nature and as wide as the earth. I see, said Sir Archie. Gad, here have I been vegetating and thinking that all excitement had gone out of life with the war, and sometimes even regretting that the beastly old thing was over, and all the while the world fairly humming with interest. And Loudon too. I would like your candid opinion on yon factor, Sir Archibald, said Dickson. I can't say I ever liked him, and I've once or twice had a row with him, for he used to bring his pals to shoot over Doutcarter and he didn't quite play the game by me. But I know dashed little about him, for I've been a lot away. Bit hairy about the heels, of course. A great figure at local race meetings, and used to toady old Carforth and the hunting crowd. He has a pretty big reputation as a sharp lawyer and some of the thick-headed lairds swear by him, but Quentin never could stick him. It's quite likely he's been getting into Queer Street, for he was always speculating in horse flesh, and I fancy he plunged a bit on the turf. But I can't think how he got mixed up in this show. I'm positive Dobson's his brother. And put this business in his way. That would explain it all right. He must be running for pretty big stakes, for that kind of lad don't dabble in crime for 6 and 8pence. Now for the layout. You've got 3 men shut up in Doutcarter House, who by this time have probably escaped. One of you, what's his name, Heritage, is in the old tower, and you think that they think the princess is still there and will sit round the place like terriers. Sometime today the Danish brig will arrive with reinforcements, and then there will be a hefty fight. Well, the first thing to be done is to get rid of Loudon's stymie with the authorities. Princess, I'm going to carry you off in my car to the chief constable. The second thing is for you after that to stay on here. It's a deadly place on a wet day, but it's safe enough. Saskia shook her head and Dickson spoke for her. You'll no get her to stop here. I've done my best, but she's determined to be back at Doutcarter. You see, she's expecting a friend, and besides, if there's going to be a battle she'd like to be in it. Is that so, ma'am? Sir Archie looked helplessly around him, and the sight of the girl's face convinced him that argument would be fruitless. Anyhow, she must come with me to the chief constable. Lethington's a slow bird on the wing, and I don't see myself convincing him that he must get busy unless I can produce the princess. Even then it may be a tough job, for it's Sunday, and in these parts people go to sleep till Monday morning. That's just what I'm trying to get at, said Dickson. By all means go to the chief constable, and tell him it's life or death. My lawyer in Glasgow, Mr. Core, will have been stirring him up yesterday, and you two should complete the job. But what I'm feared is that he'll not be in time. As you say, it's the Sabbath day, and the police are terrible slow. Now any moment that brig may be here, and the trouble will start. I'm wanting to save the princess, but I'm wanting too to give these blackguards the roughest handling they ever got in their lives. Therefore I say there's no time to lose. We're far our few to put up a fight, and we want every man you've got about this place to hold the fort till the police come. Sir Archibald looked upon the earnest flushed face of Dickson with admiration. I'm blessed if you're not the most whole-hearted brigand I've ever struck. I'm not. I'm just a businessman. Do you realize that you're levying a private war and breaking every law of the land? Hoots, said Dickson. I don't care a docken about the law. I'm for seeing this job through. What force can you produce? Only cripples, I'm afraid. There's Syme, my butler. He was a Fusilier jock and, as you saw, has lost an arm. Then McGufforg the keeper is a good man, but he's still got a Turkish bullet in his thigh. The chauffeur, Carfrey, was in the yeomanry, and lost half a foot, and there's myself, as lame as a duck. The herds on the home farm are no good, for one's 70 and the other is in bed with jaundice. The mains can produce for men, but they're rather a job lot. They'll do fine, said Dickson heartily. All soldiers, and no doubt all good shots. Have you plenty guns? Sir Archie burst into uproarious laughter. Mr. McCunn, you're a man after my own heart. I'm under your orders. If I had a boy I'd put him into the provision trade, for it's the place to see fight in. Yes, we've no end of guns. I advise shotguns, for they've more stop-in power in a rush than a rifle, and I take it it's a rough and tumble we're looking for. Right, said Dickson. I saw a bicycle in the hall. I want you to lend it me, for I must be getting back. You'll take the princess and do the best you can with the chief constable. And then? Then you'll load up your car with your folk, and come down the hill to Doutcarter. There'll be a laddie, or maybe more than one, waiting for you on this side the village to give you instructions. Take your orders from them. If it's a red-haired ruffian called Dougal, you'll be wise to heed what he says, for he has a grand head for battles. 5 minutes later Dickson was pursuing a quavering course like a snipe down the avenue. He was a miserable performer on a bicycle. Not for 20 years had he bestridden one, and he did not understand such new devices as free wheels and change of gears. The mounting had been the worst part, and it had only been achieved by the help of a rockery. He had begun by cutting into 2 flower beds, and missing a birch tree by inches. But he clung on desperately, well knowing that if he fell off it would be hard to remount, and at length he gained the avenue. When he passed the lodge gates he was riding fairly straight, and when he turned off the air highway to the side road that led to Doutcarter he was more or less master of his machine. He crossed the Garple by an ancient hunch-backed bridge, observing even in his absorption with the handle bars that the stream was in roaring spate. He wrestled up the further hill, with aching calf muscles, and got to the top just before his strength gave out. Then as the road turned seaward he had the slope with him, and enjoyed some respite. It was no case for putting up his feet, for the gale was blowing hard on his right cheek, but the downward grade enabled him to keep his course with little exertion. His anxiety to get back to the scene of action was for the moment appeased, since he knew he was making as good speed as the weather allowed, so he had leisure for thought. But the mind of this preposterous being was not on the business before him. He dallied with irrelevant things, with the problems of youth and love. He was beginning to be very nervous about Heritage, not as the solitary garrison of the old tower, but as the lover of Saskia. That everybody should be in love with her appeared to him only proper, for he had never met her like, and assumed that it did not exist. The desire of the moth for the star seemed to him a reasonable thing, since hopeless loyalty and unrequited passion were the eternal stock in trade of romance. He wished he were 25 himself to have the chance of indulging in such sentimentality for such a lady. But Heritage was not like him and would never be content with a romantic folly. He had been in love with her for 2 years, a long time. He spoke about wanting to die for her, which was a flight beyond Dickson himself. I doubt it will be what they call a grand passion, he reflected with reverence. But it was hopeless. He saw quite clearly that it was hopeless. Why, he could not have explained, for Dickson's instincts were subtler than his intelligence. He recognized that the two belonged to different circles of being, which nowhere intersected. That mysterious lady, whose eyes had looked through life to the other side, was no mate for the poet. His faithful soul was agitated, for he had developed for Heritage a sincere affection. It would break his heart, poor man. There was he holding the fort alone and cheering himself with delightful fancies about one remoter than the moon. Dickson wanted happy endings, and here there was no hope of such. He hated to admit that life could be crooked, but the optimist in him was now fairly dashed. Sir Archie might be the fortunate man, for of course he would soon be in love with her, if he were not so already. Dickson, like all his class, had a profound regard for the country gentry. The business Scot does not usually revere wealth, though he may pursue it earnestly, nor does he specially admire rank in the common sense. But for ancient race he has respect in his bones, though it may happen that in public he denies it, and the laird has for him a secular association with good family. Sir Archie might do. He was young, good-looking, obviously gallant. But no. He was not quite right either. Just a trifle too light in weight, too boyish and callow. The princess must have youth, but it should be mighty youth, the youth of a Napoleon or a Caesar. He reflected that the great Montrose, for whom he had a special veneration, might have filled the bill. Or young Harry with his beaver up. Or Claverhouse in the picture with the flush of temper on his cheek. The meditations of the match-making Dickson came to an abrupt end. He had been riding negligently, his head bent against the wind, and his eyes vaguely fixed on the wet hill gravel of the road. Of his immediate environs he was pretty well unconscious. Suddenly he was aware of figures on each side of him who advanced menacingly. Stung to activity, he attempted to increase his pace, which was already good, for the road at this point descended steeply. Then, before he could prevent it, a stick was thrust into his front wheel, and the next second he was describing a curve through the air. His head took the ground, he felt a spasm of blinding pain, and then a sense of horrible suffocation before his wits left him. "Are ye sure it's the rich man, Ecky?" said a voice which he did not hear. "Sure. It's the Gleska body Dobson telled us to look for yesterday. It's a pund note atween us for this job. We'll tie him up in the wood till we've time to attend to him." "Is he bad?" "It doesna matter," said the one called Ecky. "He'll be dead onyway long afore the morn." Mrs. Moran all forenoon was in a state of sabbatical disquiet. After she had seen Saskia and Dickson start, she finished her housewifely duties, took Cousin Eugenie her breakfast, and made preparation for the midday dinner. The invalid in the bed in the parlor was not a repaying subject. Cousin Eugenie belonged to that type of elderly women who, having been spoiled in youth, find the rest of life fall far short of their expectations. Her voice had acquired a perpetual wail, and the corners of what had once been a pretty mouth drooped in an eternal peevishness. She found herself in a morass of misery and shabby discomfort, but had her days continued in an even tenor she would still have lamented. "A dingy body," was Mrs. Moran's comment, but she labored in kindness. Unhappily they had no common language, and it was only by signs that the hostess could discover her wants and show her goodwill. She fed her and bathed her face, saw to the fire and left her to sleep. "I'm boiling a hen to mac broth for your dinner, mem. Try and get a bit sleep now." The purport of the advice was clear, and Cousin Eugenie turned obediently on her pillow. It was Mrs. Moran's custom of a Sunday to spend the morning in devout meditation. Some years before she had given up tramping the 5 miles to Kirk, on the ground that having been a regular attendant for 50 years she had got all the good out of it that was probable. Instead she read slowly aloud to herself the sermon printed in a certain religious weekly which reached her every Saturday, and concluded with a chapter or two of the Bible. But today something had gone wrong with her mind. She could not follow the thread of the Reverend Dr. MacMichael's discourse. She could not fix her attention on the wanderings and misdeeds of Israel as recorded in the book of Exodus. She must always be getting up to look at the pot on the fire, or to open the back door and study the weather. For a little she fought against her unrest, and then she gave up the attempt at concentration. She took the big pot off the fire and allowed it to simmer, and presently she fetched her boots and umbrella, and kilted her petticoats. "I'll be none the war o' a breath o' caller air," she decided. The wind was blowing great guns, but there was only the thinnest sprinkle of rain. Sitting on the hen house roof and munching a raw turnip was a figure which she recognized as the smallest of the diehards. Between bites he was singing dolefully to the tune of Annie Laurie, one of the ditties of his quondam Sunday school. "The bourgeois braes are bonny. Tu roo ra roo raloo. But the workers o' the world, wool gar them a look blue. Wool gar them a look blue. And droon them in the sea. And for bonny Annie Laurie, I'll lay me down and dee." "Losh, laddie," she cried, "that's called food for the stomach. Come indoors about midday and I'll gie ye a plate o' broth." The die-hard saluted and continued on the turnip. She took the Auchenlacan road across the Garple Bridge, for that was the best road to the Mains, and by it Dickson and the others might be returning. Her equanimity at all seasons was like a tax, and she would not have admitted that anything mortal had power to upset or excite her. Nevertheless, it was a fast-beating heart that she now bore beneath her Sunday jacket. Great events, she felt, were on the eve of happening, and of them she was a part. Dickson's anxiety was hers, to bring things to a business-like conclusion. The honor of Huntington was at stake, and of the old Kennedys. She was carrying out Mr. Quentin's commands, the dead boy who used to clamor for her treacle scones. And there was more than duty in it, for youth was not dead in her old heart, and adventure had still power to quicken it. Mrs. Moran walked well, with the steady long paces of the Scots countrywoman. She left the Auchenlacan road and took the side path along the tableland to the Mains. But for the surge of the gale and the far-borne boom of the furious sea there was little noise, not a bird cried in the uneasy air. With the wind behind her, Mrs. Moran breasted the ascent till she had on her right the moorland running south to the Locum Valley, and on her left Garple chafing in its deep forested gorges. Her eyes were quick, and she noted with interest a weasel creeping from a fern-clad cairn. A little way on she passed an old ewe in difficulties and assisted it to rise. "But for me, my woman, ye'd ha' been braxy ere nisht," she told it as it departed bleating. Then she realized that she had come a certain distance. "Losh, I maun be gettin' back or the hen will be spiled," she cried, and was on the verge of turning. But something caught her 100 yards further on the road. It was something which moved with the wind like a wounded bird, fluttering from the roadside to a puddle and then back to the rushes. She advanced to it, missed it, and caught it. It was an old dingy green felt hat, and she recognized it as Dickson's. Mrs. Moran's brain, after a second of confusion, worked fast and clearly. She examined the road and saw that a little way on the gravel had been violently agitated. She detected several prints of hobnailed boots. There were prints too, on a patch of peat on the south side behind a tall bank of sods. "That's where they were hidden," she concluded. Then she explored on the other side in a thicket of hazels and wild raspberries, and presently her perseverance was rewarded. The scrub was all crushed and pressed as if several persons had been forcing a passage. In a hollow was a gleam of something white. She moved towards it with a quaking heart, and was relieved to find that it was only a new and expensive bicycle with the front wheel badly buckled. Mrs. Moran delayed no longer. If she had walked well on her out journey, she beat all records on the return. Sometimes she would run till her breath failed, then she would slow down till anxiety once more quickened her pace. To her joy, on the Dalcarter side of the Garple Bridge she observed the figure of a die-hard. Breathless, flushed, with her bonnet awry and her umbrella held like a scimitar, she seized on the boy. "Awfu' doings. They've grip hit Maister McCunn up the Mains road just afore the second milestone and fawn at the old butched. I fund his hat, and a bicycle's lying broken in the wood. Haste ye, man, and get the rest and awa and seek him. It'll be the tinklers frae the Dean. I'd gang missile, but my legs are old. Oh, laddie, dinna stop to speak questions. They'll ha' him murdered or awa to see. And maybe the leddy was wi him and they've got them baith. Wae's me. Wae's me." The die-hard, who was wee Jakey, did not delay. His eyes had filled with tears at her news, which we know to have been his habit. When Mrs. Moran, after indulging in a moment of barbaric keening, looked back the road she had come, she saw a small figure trotting up the hill like a terrier who has been left behind. As he trotted he wept bitterly. Jakey was getting dangerous. Chapter 12. How Mr. McCunn committed an assault upon an ally. Dickson always maintained that his senses did not leave him for more than a second or two, but he admitted that he did not remember very clearly the events of the next few hours. He was conscious of a bad pain above his eyes, and something wet trickling down his cheek. There was a perpetual sound of water in his ears and of men's voices. He found himself dropped roughly on the ground and forced to walk, and was aware that his legs were inclined to wobble. Somebody had a grip on each arm, so that he could not defend his face from the brambles, and that worried him, for his whole head seemed one aching bruise and he dreaded anything touching it. But all the time he did not open his mouth, for silence was the one duty that his muddled wits enforced. He felt that he was not the master of his mind, and he dreaded what he might disclose if he began to babble. Presently there came a blank space of which he had no recollection at all. The movement had stopped, and he was allowed to sprawl on the ground. He thought that his head had got another whack from a bough, and that the pain put him into a stupor. When he awoke he was alone. He discovered that he was strapped very tightly to a young Scotch fir. His arms were bent behind him and his wrists tied together with cords knotted at the back of the tree, his legs were shackled, and further cords fastened them to the bole. Also there was a halter round the trunk and just under his chin, so that while he breathed freely enough, he could not move his head. Before him was a tangle of bracken and scrub, and beyond that the gloom of dense pines, but as he could only see directly in front his prospect was strictly circumscribed. Very slowly he began to take his bearings. The pain in his head was now dulled and quite bearable, and the flow of blood had stopped, for he felt the incrustation of it beginning on his cheeks. There was a tremendous noise all around him, and he traced this to the swaying of tree tops in the gale. But there was an undercurrent of deeper sound, water surely, water churning among rocks. It was a stream, the Garple of course, and then he remembered where he was and what had happened. I do not wish to portray Dickson as a hero, for nothing would annoy him more, but I am bound to say that his first clear thought was not of his own danger. It was intense exasperation at the miscarriage of his plans. Long ago he should have been with Dougal arranging operations, giving him news of Sir Archie, finding out how Heritage was faring, deciding how to use the coming reinforcements. Instead he was trussed up in a wood, a prisoner of the enemy, and utterly useless to his side. He tugged at his bonds, and nearly throttled himself. But they were of good tarry cord and did not give a fraction of an inch. Tears of bitter rage filled his eyes and made furrows on his encrusted cheeks. Idiot that he had wrecked everything. What would Saskia and Dougal and Sir Archie do without a businessman by their side? There would be a muddle, and the little party would walk into a trap. He saw it all very clearly. The men from the sea would overpower them, there would be murder done, and an easy capture of the princess, and the police would turn up at long last to find an empty headland. He had also most comprehensively wrecked himself, and at the thought the most genuine panic seized him. There was no earthly chance of escape, for he was tucked away in this infernal jungle till such time as his enemies had time to deal with him. As to what that dealing would be like he had no doubts, for they knew that he had been their chief opponent. Those desperate ruffians would not scruple to put an end to him. His mind dwelt with horrible fascination upon throat cutting, no doubt because of the presence of the cord below his chin. He had heard it was not a painful death, at any rate he remembered a clerk he had once had, a feeble, timid creature, who had twice attempted suicide that way. Surely it could not be very bad, and it would soon be over. But another thought came to him. They would carry him off in the ship and settle with him at their leisure. No swift merciful death for him. He had read dreadful tales of the Bolsheviks' skill in torture, and now they all came back to him, stories of Chinese mercenaries, and men buried alive, and death by agonizing inches. He felt suddenly very cold and sick, and hung in his bonds for he had no strength in his limbs. Then the pressure on his throat braced him, and also quickened his numb mind. The liveliest terror ran like quicksilver through his veins. He endured some moments of this anguish, till after many despairing clutches at his wits he managed to attain a measure of self-control. He certainly wasn't going to allow himself to become mad. Death was death whatever form it took, and he had to face death as many better men had done before him. He had often thought about it and wondered how he should behave if the thing came to him. Respectably, he had hoped, heroically, he had sworn in his moments of confidence. But he had never for an instant dreamed of this cold, lonely, dreadful business. Last Sunday, he remembered, he had been basking in the afternoon sun in his little garden and reading about the end of Fergus MacIvor in Waverley and thrilling to the romance of it, and then Tibby had come out and summoned him into tea. Then he had rather wanted to be a Jacobite in the 45 and in peril of his neck, and now Providence had taken him most terribly at his word. A week ago. He groaned at the remembrance of that sunny garden. In 7 days he had found a new world and tried a new life, and had come now to the end of it. He did not want to die, less now than ever with such wide horizons opening before him. But that was the worst of it, he reflected, for to have a great life great hazards must be taken, and there was always the risk of this sudden extinguisher. Had he to choose again, far better the smooth sheltered bypath than this accursed romantic highway onto which he had blundered. No, by heaven, no. Confound it, if he had to choose he would do it all again. Something stiff and indomitable in his soul was bracing him to a manlier humor. There was no one to see the figure strapped to the fur, but had there been a witness he would have noted that at this stage Dickson shut his teeth and that his troubled eyes looked very steadily before him. His business, he felt, was to keep from thinking, for if he thought at all there would be a flow of memories, of his wife, his home, his books, his friends, to unman him. So he steeled himself to blankness, like a sleepless man imagining white sheep in a gate. He noted a robin below the hazels, strutting impudently. And there was a tit on a bracken frond, which made the thing sway like one of the saws he used to play with as a boy. There was no wind in that undergrowth, and any movement must be due to bird or beast. The tit flew off, and the oscillations of the bracken slowly died away. Then they began again, but more violently, and Dickson could not see the bird that caused them. It must be something down at the roots of the covert, a rabbit, perhaps, or a fox, or a weasel. He watched for the first sign of the beast, and thought he caught a glimpse of tawny fur. Yes, there it was, pale dirty yellow, a weasel clearly. Then suddenly the patch grew larger, and to his amazement he looked at a human face, the face of a pallid small boy. A head disentangled itself, followed by thin shoulders, and then by a pair of very dirty bare legs. The figure raised itself and looked sharply round to make certain that the coast was clear. Then it stood up and saluted, revealing the well-known lineaments of wee Jakey. At the sight Dickson knew that he was safe by that certainty of instinct which is independent of proof, like the man who prays for a sign and has his prayer answered. He observed that the boy was quietly sobbing. Jakey surveyed the position for an instant with red-rimmed eyes and then unclasped a knife, feeling the edge of the blade on his thumb. He darted behind the fur, and a second later Dickson's wrists were free. Then he sawed at the legs, and cut the shackles which tied them together, and then most circumspectly assaulted the cord which bound Dickson's neck to the trunk. There now remained only the two bonds which fastened the legs and the body to the tree. There was a sound in the wood different from the wind and stream. Jakey listened like a startled hind. "They're coming back," he gasped. "Just you bide where ye are and let on ye still tied up." He disappeared in the scrub as inconspicuously as a rat, while two of the tinklers came up the slope from the waterside. Dickson in a fever of impatience cursed wee Jakey for not cutting his remaining bonds so that he could at least have made a dash for freedom. And then he realized that the boy had been right. Feeble and cramped as he was, he would have stood no chance in a race. One of the tinklers was the man called Ecky. He had been running hard, and was mopping his brow. "Hobbs seen the brig," he said. "It's dropping anchor ayont the Duquette's war. There's a build frae the wind and deep water. They'll be landed in half an hour. Away you up to the Hoos and tell Dobson, and me and Sim and Hob will meet the boats at the Garpelfit." The other cast a glance towards Dickson. "What about him?" he asked. The two scrutinized their prisoner from a distance of a few paces. Dickson, well aware of his peril, held himself as stiff as if every bond had been in place. The thought flashed on him that if he were too immobile they might think he was dying or dead, and come close to examine him. If they only kept their distance, the dusk of the wood would prevent them detecting Jakey's handiwork. "What'll you take to let me go?" he asked plaintively. "Nathing that you could offer, my manny," said Eki. "I'll give you a £5 note apiece." "Produce the siller," said the other. "It's in my pocket." "It's no that. We riped your pooch's lang syne. I'll take you to Glasgow with me and pay you there. Honour bright." Eki spat. "Do ye think we're gowks? Man, there's no siller you could pay would mak it worth our while to lose ye. Bide quiet there and you'll see some queer things ernished. See way, Davy." The two set off at a good pace down the stream, while Dickson's pulsing heart returned to its normal rhythm. As the sound of their feet died away, wee Jakey crawled out from cover, dry-eyed now and very business-like. He slit the last thongs, and Dickson fell limply on his face. "Losh, laddie, I'm awful stiff," he groaned. "Now, listen. Away all your pith to Dougal, and tell him that the brig's in and the men will be landing inside the hour. Tell him I'm coming as fast as my legs will let me. The princess will likely be there already and Sir Archibald and his men, but if they're no, tell Dougal they're coming. Haste you, Jakey. And see here, I'll never forget what you've done for me the day. You're a fine wee laddie." The obedient hard disappeared, and Dickson painfully and laboriously set himself to climb the slope. He decided that his quickest and safest route lay by the high road, and he had also some hopes of recovering his bicycle. On examining his body, he seemed to have sustained no very great damage, except a painful cramping of legs and arms and a certain dizziness in the head. His pockets had been thoroughly rifled, and he reflected with amusement that he, the well-to-do Mr. McCunn, did not possess at the moment a single copper. But his spirits were soaring, for somehow his escape had given him an assurance of ultimate success. Providence had directly interfered on his behalf by the hand of wee Jakey, and that surely meant that it would see him through. But his chief emotion was an ardour of impatience to get to the scene of action. He must be at Doukharter before the men from the sea. He must find Dougal and discover his dispositions. Heritage would be on guard in the tower, and in a very little the enemy would be round it. It would be just like the princess to try and enter there, but at all costs that must be hindered. She and Sir Archie must not be cornered in stone walls, but must keep their communications open and fall on the enemy's flank. Oh, if the police would only come in time, what a rounding up of miscreants that day would see! As the trees thinned on the brow of the slope and he saw the sky, he realized that the afternoon was far advanced. It must be well on for 5 o'clock. The wind still blew furiously, and the oaks on the fringes of the wood were whipped like saplings. Ruefully he admitted that the gale would not defeat the enemy. If the brig found a sheltered anchorage on the south side of the headland beyond the Garple, it would be easy enough for boats to make the Garple mouth, though it might be a difficult job to get out again. The thought quickened his steps, and he came out of cover onto the public road without a prior reconnaissance. Just in front of him stood a motor bicycle. Something had gone wrong with it, for its owner was tinkering at it, on the side farthest from Dickson. A wild hope seized him that this might be the vanguard of the police, and he went boldly towards it. The owner, who was kneeling, raised his face at the sound of footsteps, and Dickson looked into his eyes. He recognized them only too well. They belonged to the man he had seen in the inn at Kirkmichael, the man whom Heritage had decided was an Australian, but whom they now knew to be their arch-enemy, the man called Paul, who had persecuted the princess for years and whom alone of all beings on earth she feared. He had been expected before, but had arrived now in the nick of time while the brig was casting anchor. Saskia had said that he had a devil's brain, and Dickson, as he stared at him, saw a fiendish cleverness in his straight brows and a remorseless cruelty in his stiff jaw and his pale eyes. He achieved the bravest act of his life. Shaky and dizzy as he was, with freedom newly opened to him and the mental torments of his captivity still an awful recollection, he did not hesitate. He saw before him the villain of the drama, the one man that stood between the princess and peace of mind. He regarded no consequences, gave no heed to his own fate, and thought only how to put his enemy out of action. There was a big spanner lying on the ground. He seized it and with all his strength smote at the man's face. The motor cyclist, kneeling and working hard at his machine, had raised his head at Dickson's approach and beheld a wild apparition, a short man in ragged tweeds, with a bloody brow and long smears of blood on his cheeks. The next second he observed the threat of attack, and ducked his head so that the spanner only grazed his scalp. The motor bicycle toppled over, its owner sprang to his feet, and found the short man, very pale and gasping, about to renew the assault. In such a crisis there was no time for inquiry, and the cyclist was well trained in self-defense. He leaped the prostrate bicycle, and before his assailant could get in a blow brought his left fist into violent contact with his chin. Dickson tottered back a step or two and then subsided among the bracken. He did not lose his senses, but he had no more strength in him. He felt horribly ill, and struggled in vain to get up. The cyclist, a gigantic figure, towered above him. "Who the devil are you?" he was asking. "What do you mean by it?" Dickson had no breath for words, and knew that if he tried to speak he would be very sick. He could only stare up like a dog at the angry eyes. Angry beyond question they were, but surely not malevolent. Indeed, as they looked at the shameful figure on the ground, amusement filled them. The face relaxed into a smile. "Who on earth are you?" the voice repeated. And then into it came recognition. "I've seen you before. I believe you're the little man I saw last week at the Black Bull. Be so good as to explain why you want to murder me." Explanation was beyond Dickson, but his conviction was being woefully shaken. Saskia had said her enemy was as beautiful as a devil. He remembered the phrase, for he had thought it ridiculous. This man was magnificent, but there was nothing devilish in his lean grave face. "What's your name?" the voice was asking. "Tell me yours first," Dickson essayed to stutter between spasms of nausea. "My name is Alexander Nicholson," was the answer. "Then you'll know the man." It was a cry of wrath and despair. "You're a very desperate little chapter. For whom had I the honor to be mistaken?" Dickson had now wriggled into a sitting position and had clasped his hands above his aching head. "I thought you were a Russian, name of Paul," he groaned. "Paul? Paul who?" "Just Paul. A Bolshevik and an awful bad lot." Dickson could not see the change which his words wrought in the other's face. He found himself picked up in strong arms and carried to a bog pool where his battered face was carefully washed, his throbbing brows laved, and a wet handkerchief bound over them. Then he was given brandy in the socket of a flask, which eased his nausea. The cyclist ran his bicycle to the roadside, and found a seat for Dickson behind the turf dike of the old butched. "Now you are going to tell me everything," he said. "If the Paul who is your enemy is the Paul the first think him, then we are allies." But Dickson did not need this assurance. His mind had suddenly received a revelation. The princess had expected an enemy, but also a friend. Might not this be the long-awaited friend, for whose sake she was rooted to Huntington with all its terrors? "Are you sure you names no Alexis?" he asked. "In my own country I was called Alexis Nikolovich, for I am a Russian. But for some years I have made my home with your folk, and I call myself Alexander Nicholson, which is the English form. Who told you about Alexis?" "Give me your hand," said Dickson shamefacedly. "Man, she's been looking for you for weeks. You're terribly behind the fair." He cried. "For God's sake tell me all you know." She, the princess. "But what are we havering here for?" I tell you at this moment she's somewhere down about the old tower, and there's boatloads of blackguards landing from the sea. Help me up, man, for I must be off. The story will keep. Losh, it's very near the darkening. If you're Alexis, you're just about in time for a battle. But Dickson on his feet was but a frail creature. He was still deplorably giddy, and his legs showed an unpleasing tendency to crumple. I'm fair done, he moaned. You see, I've been tied up all day to a tree and had 2 sore bashes on my head. Get you on that bicycle and hurry on, and I'll hurple after you the best I can. I'll direct you the road, and if you're lucky you'll find a die hard about the village. Away with you, man, and never mind me. We go together, said the other quietly. You can sit behind me and hang on to my waist. Before you turned up I had pretty well got the thing in order. Dickson in a fever of impatience sat by while the Russian put the finishing touches to the machine, and as well as his anxiety allowed put him in possession of the main facts of the story. He told of how he and Heritage had come to Dalcarter, of the first meeting with Saskia, of the trip to Glasgow with the jewels, of the exposure of Loudon the factor, of last night's doings in the house, and of the journey that morning to the Mains of Garple. He sketched the figures on the scene: Heritage and Sir Archie, Dobson and his gang, the Gorbals diehards. He told of the enemy's plans so far as he knew them. Looked at from a business point of view, he said, the situation's like this. There's Heritage in the tower, with Dobson, Leon and Spidel sitting round him. Somewhere about the place there's the Princess and Sir Archibald and 3 men with guns from the Mains. Dougal and his 5 laddies are running loose in the policies. And there's 4 tinklers and God knows how many foreign ruffians pushing up from the Garplefoot, and a brig lying waiting to carry off the ladies. Likewise there's the police, somewhere on the road, though the dear kens when they'll turn up. It's awful the incompetence of our government, and the rates and taxes that high, and there's you and me by this roadside, and I'm no more use than a tap-tight bogle. That's the situation, and the question is what's our plan to be? We must keep the blackguards in play till the police come, and at the same time we must keep the princess out of danger. That's why I'm wanting back, for they've sore need of a business head. Yon Sir Archibald's a fine fellow, but I doubt he'll be a bit rash, and the princess is no to hold or bind. Our first job is to find Dougal and get a grip of the facts. I am going to the princess, said the Russian. That'll be best. You'll be maybe able to manage her, for you'll be well acquaint. She is my kinswoman. She is also my affianced wife. Keep us! Dickson exclaimed, with a doleful thought of Heritage. What ailed you then no to look after her better? We have been long separated, because it was her will. She had work to do and disappeared from me, though I searched all Europe for her. Then she sent me word, when the danger became extreme, and summoned me to her aid. But she gave me poor directions, for she did not know her own plans very clearly. She spoke of a place called Darkwater, and I have been hunting half Scotland for it. It was only last night that I heard of Dalcarter and guessed that that might be the name. But I was far down in Galloway, and have ridden 50 miles to a day. It's a queer thing, but I wouldn't take you for a Russian. Alexis finished his work and put away his tools. For the present, he said, I am an Englishman, till my country comes again to her senses. 10 years ago I left Russia, for I was sick of the foolishness of my class and wanted a free life in a new world. I went to Australia and made good as an engineer. I am a partner in a firm which is pretty well known even in Britain. When war broke out I returned to fight for my people, and when Russia fell out of the war, I joined the Australians in France and fought with them till the armistice. And now I have only one duty left, to save the princess and take her with me to my new home till Russia is a nation once more. Dickson whistled joyfully. So Mr. Heritage was right. I said you were an Australian. And you're a business man. That's grand hearing and puts my mind at rest. You must take charge of the party at the house, for Sir Archibald's a daft young lad and Mr. Heritage is a poet. I thought I would have to go myself, but I doubt I would just be a hindrance with my dwably legs. I'd be better outside, watching for the police. Are you ready, sir? Dickson not without difficulty perched himself astride the luggage carrier, firmly grasping the rider round the middle. The machine started, but it was evidently in a bad way, for it made poor going till the descent towards the main Auchenlacan road. On the slope it warmed up and they crossed the Garple Bridge at a fair pace. There was to be no pleasant April twilight, for the stormy sky had already made dusk, and in a very little the dark would fall. So sombre was the evening that Dickson did not notice a figure in the shadow of the roadside pines till it whistled shrilly on its fingers. He cried on Alexis to stop, and, this being accomplished with some suddenness, fell off at Dougal's feet. "What's the news?" he demanded. Dougal glanced at Alexis and seemed to approve his looks. "Napoleon has just reported that 3 boatloads, making either 23 or 20 for men they were jailed to count, has landed at Garplefit and is marking their way to the Old Tower. The tinklers warned Dobson and soon it'll be up by W.I. Heritage." "The princess is not there," was Dickson's anxious inquiry. N.A. Heritage is there his loan. They were for joining him, but I wouldn't let them. She came W.I. a man they call Sir Archibald and 3 gemkeepers W.I. guns. I stop pit their core up the road and tell them the lie o' the land. Yon Sir Archibald has poor notions o' strategy. He was for banging into the Old Tower straight away and shooting Dobson if he tried to stop them. Havers, say I, let them break their teeth on the tower, thinking the leddy's inside, and that'll give us time, for Heritage is no the lad to surrender in a hurry. Where are they now? In the Huzo Doubtcarter, and a sore job I had getting them in. We've shifted our base again, without the enemy suspecting. Any word of the police? The police, and Dougal spat cynically. It seems they're a door crop to shift. Sir Archibald was saying that him and the lassie had been to the chief constable, but the man was terrible old and slow. They converted him, but he three-pit that it would take a long time to collect his men and that there was no danger o' the brig landing a fortnight. His run there onyway, for they'll land it. Dougal, said Dickson, you've heard the princess speak of a friend she was expecting here called Alexis. This is him. You can address him as Mr. Nicholson. Just arrived in the nick of time. You must get him into the house, for he's the best right to be beside the lady. Jakey would tell you that I've been sore mishandled the day, and am no very fit for a battle. But Mr. Nicholson's a businessman and he'll do as well. You're keeping the hearts outside, I hope. Thomas Yowney's in charge, and Jakey will be in and out with orders. They've instructions to watch for the police, and keep an eye on the Garplefit. It's a mortal long front to hold, but there's no other way. I must be in the Who's Missile. Thomas Yowney's headquarters is the old wife's hen Who's. At that moment in a pause of the gale came the far-born echo of a shot. Pistol, said Alexis. Heritage, said Dougal. Trade will be getting brisk with him. Start your machine and I'll hang on a hint. We'll try the road by the West Lodge. Presently the pair disappeared in the dusk, the noise of the engine was swallowed up in the wild orchestra of the wind, and Dickson hobbled towards the village in a state of excitement which made him oblivious of his wounds. That lonely pistol shot was, he felt, the bell to ring up the curtain on the last act of the play. Chapter 13. The Coming of the Danish Brig. Mr. John Heritage, solitary in the old tower, found much to occupy his mind. His giddiness was passing, though the dregs of a headache remained, and his spirits rose with his responsibilities. At daybreak he breakfasted out of the Man's Street provision box, and made tea in one of the Hard's camp kettles. Next he gave some attention to his toilet, necessary after the rough and tumble of the night. He made shift to bathe in icy water from the tower well, shaved, tidied up his clothes and found a clean shirt from his pack. He carefully brushed his hair, reminding himself that thus had the Spartans done before Thermopylae. The neat and somewhat pallid young man that emerged from these rites then ascended to the first floor to reconnoiter the landscape from the narrow and glazed windows. If anyone had told him a week ago that he would be in so strange a world, he would have quarreled violently with his informant. A week ago he was a cynical, clear-sighted modern, a contemner of illusions, a swallower of formulas, a breaker of shams, one who had seen through the heroical and found it silly. Romance and such like toys were playthings for fatted middle age, not for strenuous and cold-eyed youth. But the truth was that now he was altogether spellbound by these toys. To think that he was serving his lady was rapture, ecstasy, that for her he was single-handed venturing all. He rejoiced to be alone with his private fancies. His one fear was that the part he had cast himself for should be needless, that the men from the sea should not come, or that reinforcements would arrive before he should be called upon. He hoped alone to make a stand against thousands. What the upshot might be he did not trouble to inquire. Of course the princess would be saved, but first he must glut his appetite for the heroic. He made a diary of events that day, just as he used to do at the front. At 8:20 he saw the first figure coming from the house. It was Spidel, who limped round the tower, tried the door, and came to a halt below the window. Heritage stuck out his head and wished him good morning, getting in reply an amazed stare. The man was not disposed to talk, though Heritage made some interesting observations on the weather, but departed quicker than he came, in the direction of the West Lodge. Just before 9 o'clock he returned with Dobson and Leon. They made a very complete reconnaissance of the tower, and for a moment Heritage thought that they were about to try to force an entrance. They tugged and hammered at the great oak door, which he had further strengthened by erecting behind it a pile of the heaviest lumber he could find in the place. It was imperative that they should not get in, and he got Dickson's pistol ready with the firm intention of shooting them if necessary. But they did nothing, except to hold a conference in the hazel clump 100 yards to the north, when Dobson seemed to be laying down the law, and Leon spoke rapidly with a great fluttering of hands. They were obviously puzzled by the sight of Heritage, whom they believed to have left the neighborhood. Then Dobson went off, leaving Leon and Spidel on guard, one at the edge of the shrubberies between the tower and the house, the other on the side nearest the lava glen. These were their posts, but they did sentry, go around the building, and passed so close to Heritage's window that he could have tossed a cigarette on their heads. It occurred to him that he ought to get busy with camouflage. They must be convinced that the princess was in the place, for he wanted their whole mind to be devoted to the siege. He rummaged among the ladies' baggage, and extracted a skirt and a colored scarf. The latter he managed to flutter so that it could be seen at the window the next time one of the watchers came within sight. He also fixed up the skirt so that the fringe of it could be seen, and, when Leon appeared below, he was in the shadow talking rapid French in a very fair imitation of the tones of Cousin Eugenie. The ruse had its effect, for Leon promptly went off to tell Spidel, and when Dobson appeared he too was given the news. This seemed to settle their plans, for all three remained on guard, Dobson nearest to the tower, seated on an outcrop of rock with his mackintosh collar turned up, and his eyes usually turned to the misty sea. By this time it was 11 o'clock, and the next 3 hours passed slowly with Heritage. He fell to picturing the fortunes of his friends. Dickson and the princess should by this time be far inland, out of danger and in the way of finding succor. He was confident that they would return, but he trusted not too soon, for he hoped for a run for his money as horseshoes in the gate. After that he was a little torn in his mind. He wanted the princess to come back and to be somewhere near if there was a fight going, so that she might be a witness of his devotion. But she must not herself run any risk, and he became anxious when he remembered her terrible sang-froid. Dickson could no more restrain her than a child could hold a greyhound. But of course it would never come to that. The police would turn up long before the brig appeared. Dougal had thought that would not be till high tide, between 4 and 5, and the only danger would be to the pirates. The 3 watchers would be put in the bag, and the men from the sea would walk into a neat trap. This reflection seemed to take all the colour out of Heritage's prospect. Peril and heroism were not to be his lot, only boredom. A little after 12, 2 of the tinklers appeared with some news which made Dobson laugh and pat them on the shoulder. He seemed to be giving them directions, pointing seaward and southward. He nodded to the tower, where Heritage took the opportunity of again fluttering Saskia's scarf athwart the window. The tinklers departed at a trot, and Dobson lit his pipe as if well pleased. He had some trouble with it in the wind, which had risen to an uncanny violence. Even the solid tower rocked with it, and the sea was a waste of spindrift and low scurrying cloud. Heritage discovered a new anxiety, this time about the possibility of the brig landing at all. He wanted a complete bag, and it would be tragic if they got only the 3 seedy ruffians now circumambulating his fortress. About 1 o'clock he was greatly cheered by the sight of Dougal. At the moment Dobson was lunching off a hunk of bread and cheese directly between the tower and the house, just short of the crest of the ridge on the other side of which lay the stables and the shrubberies. Leon was on the north side opposite the tower door, and Spidle was at the south end near the edge of the Garple Glen. Heritage, watching the ridge behind Dobson and the upper windows of the house which appeared over it, saw on the very crest something like a tuft of rusty bracken which he had not noticed before. Presently the tuft moved, and a hand shot up from it waving a rag of some sort. Dobson at the moment was engaged with a bottle of porter, and Heritage could safely wave a hand in reply. He could now make out clearly the red head of Dougal. The chieftain, having located the 3 watchers, proceeded to give an exhibition of his prowess for the benefit of the lonely inmate of the tower. Using as cover a drift of bracken, he wormed his way down till he was not 6 yards from Dobson, and Heritage had the privilege of seeing his grinning countenance a very little way above the innkeeper's head. Then he crawled back and reached the neighbourhood of Leon, who was sitting on a fallen Scotch fir. At that moment it occurred to the Belgian to visit Dobson. Heritage's breath stopped, but Dougal was ready, and froze into a motionless blur in the shadow of a hazel bush. Then he crawled very fast into the hollow where Leon had been sitting, seized something which looked like a bottle, and scrambled back to the ridge. At the top he waved the object, whatever it was, but Heritage could not reply, for Dobson happened to be looking towards the window. That was the last he saw of the chieftain, but presently he realized what was the booty he had annexed. It must be Leon's life preserver, which the night before had broken Heritage's head. After that cheering episode boredom again set in. He collected some food from the Mann Street box, and indulged himself with a glass of liqueur brandy. He was beginning to feel miserably cold, so he carried up some broken wood and made a fire on the immense hearth in the upper chamber. Anxiety was clouding his mind again, for it was now 2 o'clock, and there was no sign of the reinforcements which Dickson and the princess had gone to find. The minutes passed, and soon it was 3 o'clock, and from the window he saw only the top of the gaunt shuttered house, now and then hidden by squalls of sleet, and Dobson squatted like an Eskimo, and trees dancing like a witch would in the gale. All the vigour of the morning seemed to have gone out of his blood. He felt lonely and apprehensive and puzzled. He wished he had Dickson beside him, for that little man's cheerful voice and complacent triviality would be a comfort. Also, he was abominably cold. He put on his waterproof, and turned his attention to the fire. It needed re-kindling, and he hunted in his pockets for paper, finding only the slim volume lettered. Wells. I set it down as the most significant commentary on his state of mind. He regarded the book with intense disfavor, tore it in two, and used a handful of its fine decal-edged leaves to get the fire going. They burned well, and presently the rest followed. Well for Dickson's peace of mind that he was not a witness of such vandalism. A little warmer but in no way more cheerful, he resumed his watch near the window. The day was getting darker, and promised an early dusk. His watch told him that it was after 4, and still nothing had happened. Where on earth were Dickson and the princess? Where in the name of all that was holy were the police? Any minute now the brig might arrive and land its men, and he would be left there as a burnt offering to their wrath. There must have been an infernal muddle somewhere. Anyhow the princess was out of the trouble, but where the Lord alone knew. Perhaps the reinforcements were lying in wait for the boats at the Garple foot. That struck him as a likely explanation, and comforted him. Very soon he might hear the sound of an engagement to the south, and the next thing would be Dobson and his crew in flight. He was determined to be in the show somehow and would be very close on their heels. He felt a peculiar dislike to all three, but especially to Leon. The Belgian's small baby features had for 4 days set him clenching his fists when he thought of them. The next thing he saw was one of the tinklers running hard towards the tower. He cried something to Dobson, which Heritage could not catch, but which woke the latter to activity. The innkeeper shouted to Leon and Spidel, and the tinkler was excitedly questioned. Dobson laughed and slapped his thigh. He gave orders to the others, and himself joined the tinkler and hurried off in the direction of the Garple foot. Something was happening there, something of ill omen, for the man's face and manner had been triumphant. Were the boats landing? As Heritage puzzled over this event, another figure appeared on the scene. It was a big man in knickerbockers and mackintosh, who came round the end of the house from the direction of the South Lodge. At first he thought it was the advance guard from his own side, the help which Dickson had gone to find, and he only restrained himself in time from shouting a welcome. But surely their supports would not advance so confidently in enemy country. The man strode over the slopes as if looking for somebody, then he caught sight of Leon and waved him to come. Leon must have known him, for he hastened to obey. The two were about 30 yards from Heritage's window. Leon was telling some story volubly, pointing now to the tower and now towards the sea. The big man nodded as if satisfied. Heritage noted that his right arm was tied up, and that the mackintosh sleeve was empty, and that brought him enlightenment. It was Loudon the factor, whom Dickson had winged the night before. The two of them passed out of view in the direction of Spidel. The sight awoke Heritage to the supreme unpleasantness of his position. He was utterly alone on the headland, and his allies had vanished into space, while the enemy plans, moving like clockwork, were approaching their consummation. For a second he thought of leaving the tower and hiding somewhere in the cliffs. He dismissed the notion unwillingly, for he remembered the task that had been set him. He was there to hold the fort to the last to gain time, though he could not for the life of him see what use time was to be when all the strategy of his own side seemed to have miscarried. Anyhow, the blackguards would be sold, for they would not find the princess. But he felt a horrid void in the pit of his stomach, and a looseness about his knees. The moments passed more quickly as he wrestled with his fears. The next he knew the empty space below his window was filling with figures. There was a great crowd of them, rough fellows with seamen's coats, still dripping as if they had had a wet landing. Dobson was with them, but for the rest they were strange figures. Now that the expected had come at last, Heritage's nerves grew calmer. He made out that the newcomers were trying the door, and he waited to hear it fall, for such a mob could soon force it. But instead a voice called from beneath. "Will you please open to us?" it said. He stuck his head out and saw a little group with one man at the head of it, a young man clad in oilskins whose face was dim in the murky evening. The voice was that of a gentleman. "I have orders to open to no one," Heritage replied. "Then I fear we must force an entrance," said the voice. "You can go to the devil," said Heritage. That defiance was the screw which his nerves needed. His temper had risen, he had forgotten all about the princess, he did not even remember his isolation. His job was to make a fight for it. He ran up the staircase which led to the attics of the tower, for he recollected that there was a window there which looked over the ground before the door. The place was ruinous, the floor filled with holes, and a part of the roof sagged down in a corner. The stones around the window were loose and crumbling, and he managed to pull several out so that the slit was enlarged. He found himself looking down on a crowd of men, who had lifted the fallen tree on which Leon had perched, and were about to use it as a battering ram. "The first fellow who comes within 6 yards of the door I shoot," he shouted. There was a white wave below as every face was turned to him. He ducked back his head in time as a bullet chipped the side of the window. But his position was a good one, for he had a hole in the broken wall through which he could see, and could shoot with his hand at the edge of the window while keeping his body in cover. The battering party resumed their task, and as the tree swung nearer, he fired at the foremost of them. He missed, but the shot for a moment suspended operations. Again they came on, and again he fired. This time he damaged somebody, for the trunk was dropped. A voice gave orders, a sharp authoritative voice. The battering squad dissolved, and there was a general withdrawal out of the line of fire from the window. Was it possible that he had intimidated them? He could hear the sound of voices, and then a single figure came into sight again, holding something in its hand. He did not fire, for he recognized the futility of his efforts. The baseball swing of the figure below could not be mistaken. There was a roar beneath, and a flash of fire, as the bomb exploded on the door. Then came a rush of men, and the tower had fallen. Heritage clambered through a hole in the roof and gained the topmost parapet. He had still a pocketful of cartridges, and therein a coin of the old battlements. He would prove an ugly customer to the pursuit. Only one at a time could reach that siege perilous. They would not take long to search the lower rooms, and then would be hot on the trail of the man who had fooled them. He had not a scrap of fear left or even of anger, only triumph at the thought of how properly those ruffians had been sold. Like schoolboys they who unaware, instead of 2 women they had found a man with a gun. And the princess was miles off and forever beyond their reach. When they had settled with him they would no doubt burn the house down, but that would serve them little. From his airy pinnacle he could see the whole sea front of Huntington, a blur in the dusk but for the ghostly eyes of its white, shuttered windows. Something was coming from it, running lightly over the lawns, lost for an instant in the trees, and then appearing clear on the crest of the ridge where some hours earlier Dougal had lain. With horror he saw that it was a girl. She stood with the wind plucking at her skirts and hair, and she cried in a high, clear voice which pierced even the confusion of the gale. What she cried he could not tell, for it was in a strange tongue. But it reached the besiegers. There was a sudden silence in the din below him and then a confusion of shouting. The men seemed to be pouring out of the gap which had been the doorway, and as he peered over the parapet first one and then another entered his area of vision. The girl on the ridge, as soon as she saw that she had attracted attention, turned and ran back, and after her up the slopes went the pursuit, bunched like hounds on a good scent. Mr. John Heritage, swearing terribly, started to retrace his steps. Chapter 14. The Second Battle of the Cruives. The military historian must often make shift to write of battles with slender data, but he can pad out his deficiencies by learned parallels. If his were the talented pen describing this, the latest action fought on British soil against a foreign foe, he would no doubt be crippled by the absence of written orders and war diaries. But how eloquently he would descant on the resemblance between Dougal and Gouraud, how the plan of leaving the enemy to waste his strength upon a deserted position was that which on the 15th of July, 1918, the French general had used with decisive effect in Champagne. But Dougal had never heard of Gouraud, and I cannot claim that, like the happy warrior, he through the heat of conflict kept the law in calmness made, and saw what he foresaw. I have had the benefit of discussing the affair with him and his colleagues, but I should offend against historic truth if I represented the main action as anything but a scrimmage, a soldier's battle, the historian would say, a malplaquet, an albura. Just after 3:30 that afternoon the commander-in-chief was revealed in a very bad temper. He had intercepted Sir Archie's car, and, since Leon was known to be fully occupied, had brought it in by the West Lodge, and hidden it behind a clump of laurels. There he had held a hoarse council of war. He had cast an appraising eye over Syme the butler, Carfrae the chauffeur, and MacGufforg the gamekeeper, and his brows had lightened when he beheld Sir Archie with an armful of guns and 2 big cartridge magazines. But they had darkened again at the first words of the leader of the reinforcements. "Now for the tower," Sir Archie had observed cheerfully. "We should be a match for the 3 watchers, my lad, and it's time that poor devil Watts, his name, was relieved." "A bonny, like plan that would be," said Dougal. "Man, you would be walking into the very trap they want. In an hour, or maybe 2, the rest will turn up from the sea and they'd have you tight by the neck. N.A. It's time we're wanting, and the longer they think we're in the old tower the better for us. What news o' the police?" He listened to Sir Archie's report with a gloomy face. "Not afore the darkening. They'll be our late, the police are our late. It looks as if we had the job to do ourselves. What's your notion?" "God knows," said the baronet, whose eyes were on Saskia. "What's yours?" The deference conciliated Dougal. "There's just the one plan that's worth a dock ken. There's 5 o' us here, and there's plenty weapons. Besides, there's 5 died hard somewhere about, and though they've never tried it afore, they can be trusted to loose off a gun. My advice is to hide at the Garplefoot and stop the boats landing. We'd have the Tinklers on our flank, no doubt, but I'm not muckle feared o' them. It wouldn't be easy for the boats to get in wi' this tearing wind and us fearing volleys from the shore." Sir Archie stared at him with admiration. "You're a hearty young fire-eater. But great Scott! We can't go putting at strangers before we find out their business. This is a law Aberdeen country, and we're not entitled to start shooting except in self-defense. You can wash that plan out, for it ain't feasible." Dougal spat cynically. "For all that it's the right strategy. Man, we might sink the lot, and then turn and settle W.I. Dobson, and all afore the first policeman showed his neb. It would be a grand performance. But I was feared you wouldn't be for it. Well, there's just the one other thing to do. We must get inside the house and put it in a state of defense. Heritage has McCunn's pistol, and he'll keep them busy for a bit. When they've finished wi' him and find the place is empty, they'll try the house and we'll give them a warm reception. That should keep us going till the police arrive, unless they're coming wi' the blind carrier." Sir Archie nodded. "But why put ourselves in their power at all? They're at present barking up the wrong tree. Let them bark up another wrong UN. Why shouldn't the house remain empty? I take it we're here to protect the princess. Well, we'll have done that if they go off empty-handed." Dougal looked up to the heavens. "I wish McCunn was here," he sighed. We've got to protect the princess, and there's just the one way to do it, and that's to put an end to this crowd o' blackguards. If they gang empty-handed, they'll come again another day, either here or somewhere else, and it won't be long afore they get the lassie. But if we finish with them now, she can sit down wi' in easy mind. That's why we've got to hang on to them till the police comes. There's no way out o' this business but a battle." He found an ally. "Dougal is right," said Saskia. "If I am to have peace, by some way or other the fangs of my enemies must be drawn forever." He swung round and addressed her formally. "Mem, I'm asking ye for the last time. Will ye keep out of this business? Will ye gang back and sit down aside Mrs. Moran's fire and have your tea and wait till we come for ye? Ye can do no good, and ye putting yourself terrible in the enemy's power. If we're beat and ye know there, they get very little satisfaction, but if they get ye they get what they've come seeking. I tell ye straight ye an encumbrance." She laughed mischievously. "I can shoot better than you," she said. He ignored the taunt. "Will ye listen to sense and fall to the rear?" "I will not," she said. "Then gang your own gait. I'm all wise to argy bargy wi' women. The whose be it?" It was a journey which sorely tried Dougal's temper. The only way in was by the veranda, but the door at the west end had been locked, and the ladder had disappeared. Now of his party 3 were lame, 1 lacked an arm, and 1 was a girl. Besides, there were the guns and cartridges to transport. Moreover, at more than one point before the veranda was reached, the route was commanded by a point on the ridge near the old tower, and that had been Spidle's position when Dougal made his last reconnaissance. It behoved to pass these points swiftly and unobtrusively, and his company was neither swift nor unobtrusive. MacGufforg had a genius for tripping over obstacles, and Sir Archie was forever proffering his aid to Saskia, who was in a position to give rather than to receive, being far the most active of the party. Once Dougal had to take the gamekeeper's head and force it down, a performance which would have led to an immediate assault but for Sir Archie's presence. Nor did the latter escape. "Will ye stop heeding the lassie, and attend to your own job?" the chieftain growled. "Ye remarking as much noise as a road roller." Arrived at the foot of the veranda wall, there remained the problem of the escalade. Dougal clambered up like a squirrel by the help of cracks in the stones, and he could be heard trying the handle of the door into the house. He was absent for about 5 minutes, and then his head peeped over the edge accompanied by the hooks of an iron ladder. From the boiler house, he informed them as they stood clear for the thing to drop. It proved to be little more than half the height of the wall. Saskia ascended first, and had no difficulty in pulling herself over the parapet. Then came the guns and ammunition, and then the one-armed Syme, who turned out to be an athlete. But it was no easy matter getting up the last 3. Sir Archie anathematized his frailties. "Nice old crock to go tiger shooting with," he told the princess. "But set me to something where my confounded leg don't get in the way, and I'm still pretty useful." Dougal, mopping his brow with the rag he called his handkerchief, observed sourly that he objected to going scouting with a herd of elephants. Once indoors, his spirits rose. The party from the mains had brought several electric torches, and the one lamp was presently found and lit. "We can't count on the police," Dougal announced, "and when the foreigners is finished the tower they'll come on here. If no, we must make them. What is it the sodgers call it? Forcing a battle. Now see here. There's the 2 roads into this place, the back door and the verandah, leaving out the front door which is chained and lock it. They'll try those 2 roads first, and we must get them well barricaded in time. But mind, if there's a good few o' them, it'll be an easy job to batter in the front door or the windies, so we maun be ready for that." He told off a fatigue party, the princess, Sir Archie, and MacGufforg, to help in moving furniture to the several doors. Simon Carfrae attended to the kitchen entrance, while he himself made a tour of the ground floor windows. For half an hour the empty house was loud with strange sounds. MacGufforg, who was a giant in strength, filled the passage at the veranda end with an assortment of furniture ranging from a grand piano to a vast mahogany sofa, while Saskia and Sir Archie pillaged the bedrooms and packed up the interstices with mattresses in lieu of sandbags. Dougal on his return saw fit to approve their work. "That'll fickle the blackguards. Down at the kitchen door we've got a mangle, 5 wash tubs and the best part of a ton o' coal. It's the windies I'm anxious about, for they are big to fill up. But I've gotten tubs o' water below them and a lot o' wire netting I fund in the cellar." Sir Archie morosely wiped his brow. "I can't say I ever hated a job more," he told Saskia. "It seems pretty cool to march into somebody else's house and make free with his furniture. I hope to goodness our friends from the sea do turn up, or we'll look pretty foolish. Loudon will have a score against me he won't forget." "Ye no weakening?" asked Dougal fiercely. "Not a bit. Only hoping somebody hasn't made a mighty big mistake. Ye needn't be feared for that. Now you listen to your instructions. We're terrible few for such a big place, but we maun make up for shortness o' numbers by extra mobility. The gemkeeper will keep the windy that looks on the verandah, and fell any man that gets through. You'll hold the verandah door, and the other lame man, Carfrae ye call him, will keep the back door. I've telled the one-armed man, who has some kind of a head on him, that he maun keep on the move, watching to see if they try the front door or any o' the other windies. If they do, he takes his station there. Do ye follow? Sir Archie nodded gloomily. What is my post? Saskia asked. I've appointed ye my chief of staff, was the answer. Ye see we've no reserves. If this door's the dangerous bit, it maun be reinforced from elsewhere, and that'll want savage thinking. Ye'll have to be on the move, mem, and keep me informed. If they break in at 2 bits, we're beat, and there'll be nothing for it but to retire to our last position. Ye ken the room ayont the hall where they keep the coats. That's our last trench, and at the worst we fall back there and stick it out. It has a strong door and a wee windy, so they'll no be able to get in on our rear. We should be able to put up a good defence there, unless they fire the place over our heads. Now, we'd better give out the guns. We don't want any shooting if we can avoid it, said Sir Archie, who found his distaste for Dougal growing, though he was under the spell of the one being there who knew precisely his own mind. Just what I was going to say. My instructions is, reserve your fire, and don't loose off till you have a man up against the end o' your barrel. Good Lord, we'll get into a horrible row. The whole thing may be a mistake, and will be had up for wholesale homicide. No man shall fire unless I give the word. The commander-in-chief looked at him darkly. Some bitter retort was on his tongue, but he restrained himself. It appears, he said, that ye think I'm doing all this for fun. I'll no RGWI ye. There can be just the one general in a battle, but I'll give ye permission to say the word when to fire. MacGregor, he muttered, a strange expletive only used in moments of deep emotion. I'll wager ye'll be for saying the word afore I'd say it, Missile Dot. He turned to the princess. I hand over to you, till I am back, for I maun be off and see to the dyed hearts. I wish I could bring them in here, but I daren't lose my communications. I'll likely get in by the boiler house skylight when I come back, but it might be as well to keep a road open here unless ye actually attacked. Dougal clambered over the mattresses and the grand piano. A flicker of waning daylight appeared for a second as he squeezed through the door, and Sir Archie was left staring at the wrathful countenance of MacGuffog. He laughed ruefully. I've been in about 40 battles, and here's that little devil rather worried about my pluck, and talking to me like a corps commander to a newly joined second lieutenant. All the same he's a remarkable child, and would better behave as if we were in for a real shindy. What do you think, princess? I think we are in for what you call a shindy. I am in command, remember. I order you to serve out the guns. This was done, a shot, gun and 100 cartridges to each, while MacGuffog, who was a marksman, was also given a sporting mannlicher, and 2 other rifles, a .303 and a small bore Holland, were kept in reserve in the hall. Sir Archie, free from Dougal's compelling presence, gave the gamekeeper peremptory orders not to shoot till he was bidden, and Carfrey at the kitchen door was warned to the same effect. The shuttered house, where the only light apart from the garden room was the feeble spark of the electric torches, had the most disastrous effect upon his spirits. The gale which roared in the chimney and eddied among the rafters of the hall seemed an infernal commotion in a tomb. Let's go upstairs, he told Saskia, there must be a view from the upper windows. You can see the top of the old tower, and part of the sea, she said. I know it well, for it was my only amusement to look at it. On clear days, too, one could see high mountains far in the west. His depression seemed to have affected her, for she spoke listlessly, unlike the vivid creature who had led the way in. In a gaunt west-looking bedroom, the one in which Heritage and Dickson had camped the night before, they opened a fold of the shutters and looked out into a world of grey rack and driving rain. The tower roof showed mistily beyond the ridge of down, but its environs were not in their prospect. The lower regions of the house had been gloomy enough, but this bleak place with its drab outlook struck a chill to Sir Archie's soul. He dolefully lit a cigarette. "This is a pretty rotten show for you," he told her. "It strikes me as a rather unpleasant brand of nightmare." "I have been living with nightmares for 3 years," she said wearily. He cast his eyes round the room. "I think the Kennedys were mad to build this confounded barrack. I've always disliked it, and old Quentin hadn't any use for it either. Cold, cheerless, raw monstrosity. It hasn't been a very giddy place for you, princess. It has been my prison, when I hoped it would be a sanctuary. But it may yet be my salvation." "I'm sure I hope so. I say, you must be jolly hungry. I don't suppose there's any chance of tea for you." She shook her head. She was looking fixedly at the tower, as if she expected something to appear there, and he followed her eyes. "Rum old shell, that. Quentin used to keep all kinds of livestock there, and when we were boys it was our castle where we played at being robber chiefs. It'll be dashed queer if the real thing should turn up this time. I suppose McCunn's poet is roosting there all by his lone. Can't say I envy him his job." Suddenly she caught his arm. "I see a man," she whispered. "There. He is behind those far bushes. There is his head again." It was clearly a man, but he presently disappeared, for he had come round by the south end of the house, past the stables, and had now gone over the ridge. "The cut of his jib is uncommonly like Loudon, the factor. I thought McCunn had stretched him on a bed of pain. Lord, if this thing should turn out a farce, I simply can't face Loudon. I say, princess, you don't suppose by any chance that McCunn's a little bit wrong in the head?" She turned her candid eyes on him. "You are in a very doubting mood." "My feet are cold and I don't mind admitting it. Hanged if I know what it is, but I don't feel this show a bit real. If it isn't, we're in a fair way to make howling idiots of ourselves, and get pretty well embroiled with the law. It's all right for the red-haired boy, for he can take everything seriously, even play. I could do the same thing myself when I was a kid. I don't mind running some kinds of risk, I've had a few in my time, but this is so infernally outlandish and I don't quite believe in it. That is to say, I believe in it right enough when I look at you or listen to McCunn, but as soon as my eyes are off you I begin to doubt again. I'm getting old and I've a stake in the country, and I dare say I'm getting a bit of a prig anyway. I don't want to make a jackass of myself. Besides, there's this foul weather and this beastly house to ice my feet." He broke off with an exclamation, for on the grey cloud-bounded stage in which the roof of the tower was the central feature, actors had appeared. Dim hurrying shapes showed through the mist, dipping over the ridge, as if coming from the Garplefoot. She seized his arm and he saw that her listlessness was gone. Her eyes were shining. "It is they," she cried. "The nightmare is real at last. Do you doubt now?" He could only stare, for these shapes arriving and vanishing like wisps of fog still seemed to him phantasmal. The girl held his arm tightly clutched, and craned towards the window space. He tried to open the frame, and succeeded in smashing the glass. A swirl of wind drove inwards and blew a loose lock of Saskia's hair across his brow. "I wish Dougal were back," he muttered, and then came the crack of a shot. The pressure on his arm slackened, and a pale face was turned to him. "He is alone, Mr. Heritage. He has no chance. They will kill him like a dog." "They'll never get in," he assured her. "Dougal said the place could hold out for hours." Another shot followed and presently a third. She twined her hands and her eyes were wild. "We can't leave him to be killed," she gasped. "It's the only game. We're playing for time, remember. Besides, he won't be killed. Great Scott!" As he spoke, a sudden explosion cleft the drone of the wind and a patch of gloom flashed into yellow light. "Bomb!" he cried. "Lord, I might have thought of that." The girl had sprung back from the window. "I cannot bear it. I will not see him murdered in sight of his friends. I am going to show myself, and when they see me they will leave him. No, you must stay here. Presently they will be round this house. Don't be afraid for me, I am very quick of foot. For God's sake, don't. Here, princess, stop, and he clutched at her skirt. Look here, I'll go. You can't. You have been wounded. I am in command, you know. Keep the door open till I come back. He hobbled after her, but she easily eluded him. She was smiling now, and blew a kiss to him. La, 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 she trilled, as she ran down the stairs. He heard her voice below, admonishing McGufforg. Then he pulled himself together and went back to the window. He had brought the little Holland with him, and he poked its barrel through the hole in the glass. Curse my game leg, he said, almost cheerfully, for the situation was now becoming one with which he could cope. I ought to be able to hold up the pursuit a bit. My aunt? What a girl! With the rifle cuddled to his shoulder he watched a slim figure come into sight on the lawn, running towards the ridge. He reflected that she must have dropped from the high veranda wall. That reminded him that something must be done to make the wall climbable for her return, so he went down to McGufforg, and the two squeezed through the barricaded door to the veranda. The boiler house ladder was still in position, but it did not reach half the height, so McGufforg was adjured to stand by to help, and in the meantime to wait on duty by the wall. Then he hurried upstairs to his watch tower. The girl was in sight, almost on the crest of the high ground. There she stood for a moment, one hand clutching at her errant hair, the other shielding her eyes from the sting of the rain. He heard her cry, as Heritage had heard her, but since the wind was blowing towards him the sound came louder and fuller. Again she cried, and then stood motionless with her hands above her head. It was only for an instant, for the next he saw she had turned and was racing down the slope, jumping the little scrogs of hazel like a deer. On the ridge appeared faces, and then over it swept a mob of men. She had a start of some 50 yards, and labored to increase it, having doubtless the veranda wall in mind. Sir Archie, sick with anxiety, nevertheless spared time to admire her prowess. Gad! She's a miler, he ejaculated. She'll do it. I'm hanged if she don't do it. Against men in seaman's boots and heavy clothing she had a clear advantage. But two shook themselves loose from the pack and began to gain on her. At the main shrubbery they were not 30 yards behind, and in her passage through it her skirts must have delayed her, for when she emerged the pursuit had halved the distance. He got the sights of the rifle on the first man, but the lawn sloped up towards the house, and to his consternation he found that the girl was in the line of fire. Madly he ran to the other window of the room, tore back the shutters, shivered the glass, and flung his rifle to his shoulder. The fellow was within 3 yards of her, but thank God! He had now a clear field. He fired low and just ahead of him, and had the satisfaction to see him drop like a rabbit, shot in the leg. His companion stumbled over him, and for a moment the girl was safe. But her speed was failing. She passed out of sight on the veranda side of the house, and the rest of the pack had gained ominously over the easier ground of the lawn. He thought for a moment of trying to stop them by his fire, but realized that if every shot told there would still be enough of them left to make sure of her capture. The only chance was at the veranda, and he went downstairs at a pace undreamed of since the days when he had 2 whole legs. McGufforg, manlicher in hand, was poking his neck over the wall. The pursuit had turned the corner and were about 20 yards off. The girl was at the foot of the ladder, breathless, drooping with fatigue. She tried to climb, limply and feebly, and very slowly, as if she were too giddy to see clear. Above were 2 cripples, and at her back the van of the now triumphant pack. Sir Archie, game leg or no, was on the parapet preparing to drop down and hold off the pursuit were it only for seconds. But at that moment he was aware that the situation had changed. At the foot of the ladder a tall man seemed to have sprung out of the ground. He caught the girl in his arms, climbed the ladder, and McGuffog's great hands reached down and seized her and swung her into safety. Up the wall, by means of cracks and tufts, was shinning a small boy. The stranger coolly faced the pursuers, and at the sight of him they checked, those behind stumbling against those in front. He was speaking to them in a foreign tongue, and to Sir Archie's ear the words were like the crack of a lash. Their hesitation was only for a moment, for a voice among them cried out, and the whole pack gave tongue shrilly and surged on again. But that instant of check had given the stranger his chance. He was up the ladder, and, gripping the parapet, found rest for his feet in a fissure. Then he bent down, drew up the ladder, handed it to McGuffog, and with a mighty heave pulled himself over the top. He seemed to hope to defend the veranda, but the door at the west end was being assailed by a contingent of the enemy, and he saw that its thin woodwork was yielding. "Into the house," he cried, as he picked up the ladder and tossed it over the wall on the pack surging below. He was only just in time, for the west door yielded. In 2 steps he had followed McGuffog through the chink into the passage, and the concussion of the grand piano pushed hard against the veranda door from within coincided with the first battering on the said door from without. In the garden room the feeble lamp showed a strange grouping. Saskia had sunk into a chair to get her breath, and seemed too dazed to be aware of her surroundings. Dougal was manfully striving to appear at his ease, but his lip was quivering. "A near thing that time," he observed. "It was the blame of that man's old motor bicycle." The stranger cast sharp eyes around the place and company. "An awkward corner, gentlemen," he said. "How many are there of you? 4 men and a boy? And you have placed guards at all the entrances?" "They have bombs," Sir Archie reminded him. "No doubt. But I do not think they will use them here or their guns, unless there is no other way. Their purpose is kidnapping, and they hope to do it secretly and slip off without leaving a trace. If they slaughter us, as they easily can, the cry will be out against them, and their vessel will be unpleasantly hunted. Half their purpose is already spoiled, for it is no longer secret. They may break us by sheer weight, and I fancy the first shooting will be done by us. It's the windows I'm afraid of." Some tone in his quiet voice reached the girl in the wicker chair. She looked up wildly, saw him, and with a cry of Alicia ran to his arms. There she hung, while his hand fondled her hair, like a mother with a scared child. Sir Archie, watching the whole thing in some stupefaction, thought he had never in his days seen more nobly matched human creatures. "It is my friend," she cried triumphantly, "the friend whom I appointed to meet me here. Oh, I did well to trust him. Now we need not fear anything." As if in ironical answer came a great crashing at the veranda door, and the twanging of chords cruelly mishandled. The grand piano was suffering internally from the assaults of the boiler house ladder. "Will I gee them a shot?" was McGuffog's hoarse inquiry. "Action stations," Alexis ordered, for the command seemed to have shifted to him from Dougal. "The windows are the danger. The boy will patrol the ground floor, and give us warning, and I and this man," pointing to Syme, "will be ready at the threatened point. And for God's sake no shooting, unless I give the word. If we take them on at that game we haven't a chance." He said something to Saskia in Russian and she smiled assent and went to Sir Archie's side. "You and I must keep this door," she said. Sir Archie was never very clear afterwards about the events of the next hour. The princess was in the maddest spirits, as if the burden of 3 years had slipped from her and she was back in her first girlhood. She sang as she carried more lumber to the pile, perhaps the song which had once entranced Heritage, but Sir Archie had no ear for music. She mocked at the furious blows which rained at the other end, for the door had gone now, and in the windy gap could be seen a blur of dark faces. Oddly enough, he found his own spirits mounting to meet hers. It was real business at last, the qualms of the civilian had been forgotten, and there was rising in him that joy in a scrap which had once made him one of the most daring airmen on the Western Front. The only thing that worried him now was the coyness about shooting. What on earth were his rifles and guns for unless to be used? He had seen the enemy from the veranda wall, and a more ruffianly crew he had never dreamed of. They meant the uttermost business, and against such it was surely the duty of good citizens to wage whole-hearted war. The princess was humming to herself a nursery rhyme. "The King of Spain's daughter," she crooned, "came to visit me, and all for the sake of that poor piano." In her clear voice she cried something in Russian, and the wind carried a laugh from the veranda. At the sound of it she stopped. "I had forgotten," she said. "Paul is there." "I had forgotten." After that she was very quiet, but she redoubled her labors at the barricade. To the man it seemed that the pressure from without was slackening. He called to McGufforg to ask about the garden room window, and the reply was reassuring. The gamekeeper was gloomily contemplating Dougal's tubs of water and wire netting, as he might have contemplated a vermin trap. Sir Archie was growing acutely anxious, the anxiety of the defender of a straggling fortress which is vulnerable at a dozen points. It seemed to him that strange noises were coming from the rooms beyond the hall. Did the back door lie that way? And was not there a smell of smoke in the air? If they tried fire in such a gale the place would burn like matchwood. He left his post and in the hall found Dougal. "All quiet," the chieftain reported. "Far out quiet. I don't like it. The enemy's no putting out his strength yet. The Russian says the West Windies are terrible dangerous. Him and the chauffeurs doing their best, but ye can't block they muckle glass panes." He returned to the princess, and found that the attack had indeed languished on that particular barricade. The withers of the grand piano were left unrung, and only a faint scuffling informed him that the veranda was not empty. "They're gathering for an attack elsewhere," he told himself. But what if that attack were a feint? He and McGufforg must stick to their post, for in his belief the veranda door and the garden room window were the easiest places where an entry in mass could be forced. Suddenly Dougal's whistle blew, and with it came a most almighty crash somewhere towards the west side. With a shout of "Hold tight, McGufforg," Sir Archie bolted into the hall, and, led by the sound, reached what had once been the lady's bedroom. A strange sight met his eyes, for the whole framework of one window seemed to have been thrust inward, and in the gap Alexis was swinging a fender. 3 of the enemy were in the room, one senseless on the floor, one in the grip of Syme, whose single hand was tightly clenched on his throat, and one engaged with Dougal in a corner. The die-hard leader was sore pressed, and to his help Sir Archie went. The fresh assault made the seaman duck his head, and Dougal seized the occasion to smite him hard with something which caused him to roll over. It was Spidle's life preserver which he had annexed that afternoon. Alexis at the window seemed to have for a moment daunted the attack. "Bring that table," he cried, and the thing was jammed into the gap. "Now you this to Syme, get the man from the back door to hold this place with his gun. There's no attack there. It's about time for shooting now, or we'll have them in our rear. What in heaven is that?" It was McGufforg whose great bellow resounded down the corridor. Sir Archie turned and shuffled back, to be met by a distressing spectacle. The lamp, burning as peacefully as it might have burned on an old lady's tea table, revealed the window of the garden room driven bodily inward, shutters and all, and now forming an inclined bridge over Dougal's ineffectual tubs. In front of it stood McGufforg, swinging his gun by the barrel and yelling curses, which, being mainly couched in the vernacular, were happily meaningless to Saskia. She herself stood at the hall door, plucking at something hidden in her breast. He saw that it was a little ivory-handled pistol. The enemy's feint had succeeded, for even as Sir Archie looked 3 men leaped into the room. On the neck of one the butt of McGufforg's gun crashed, but 2 scrambled to their feet and made for the girl. Sir Archie met the first with his fist, a clean drive on the jaw, followed by a damaging hook with his left that put him out of action. The other hesitated for an instant and was lost, for McGufforg caught him by the waist from behind and sent him through the broken frame to join his comrades without. Up the stairs, Dougal was shouting, for the little room beyond the hall was clearly impossible. Our flanks turned. They're pouring through the other windy. Out of a corner of his eye Sir Archie caught sight of Alexis, with Syme and Carfrae in support, being slowly forced towards them along the corridor. Upstairs, he shouted. Come on, MacGuffog. Lead on, princess. He dashed out the lamp, and the place was in darkness. With this retreat from the forward trench line ended the opening phase of the battle. It was achieved in good order, and position was taken up on the first-floor landing, dominating the main staircase and the passage that led to the back stairs. At their back was a short corridor ending in a window which gave on the north side of the house above the veranda, and from which an active man might descend to the veranda roof. It had been carefully reconnoitred beforehand by Dougal, and his were the dispositions. The odd thing was that the retreating force were in good heart. The three men from the mains were warming to their work, and MacGuffog wore an air of genial ferocity. Dashed fine position I call this, said Sir Archie. Only Alexis was silent and preoccupied. We are still at their mercy, he said. Pray God your police come soon. He forbade shooting yet a while. The lady is our strong card, he said. They won't use their guns while she is with us, but if it ever comes to shooting they can wipe us out in a couple of minutes. One of you watch that window, for Paula Breskoff is no fool. Their exhilaration was short-lived. Below in the hall it was black darkness save for a greyness at the entrance of the veranda passage, but the defence was soon aware that the place was thick with men. Presently there came a scuffling from Carfrae's post towards the back stairs, and a cry as of someone choking. And at the same moment a flare was lit below which brought the whole hall from floor to rafters into blinding light. It revealed a crowd of figures, some still in the hall and some half-way up the stairs, and it revealed, too, more figures at the end of the upper landing where Carfrae had been stationed. The shapes were motionless like mannequins in a shop window. They've got us treed all right, Sir Archie groaned. What the devil are they waiting for? They wait for their leader, said Alexis. No one of the party will ever forget the ensuing minutes. After the hubbub of the barricades the ominous silence was like icy water, chilling and petrifying with an indefinable fear. There was no sound but the wind, but presently mingled with it came odd wild voices. Here to the warps, MacGuffog whispered. Sir Archie, who found the tension unbearable, sought relief in contradiction. You're an unscientific brute, MacGuffog, he told his henchman. It's a disgrace that a gamekeeper should be such a rotten naturalist. What would warps be doing here at this time of year? The same, I could swear it's warps, Sir Archibald. Then Dougal broke in and his voice was excited. It's no warps. That's our patrol signal. Man, there's hope for us yet. I believe it's the police. His words were unheeded, for the figures below drew apart and a young man came through them. His beautifully shaped dark head was bare, and as he moved he unbuttoned his oilskins and showed the trim dark blue garb of the yachtsman. He walked confidently up the stairs, an odd elegant figure among his heavy companions. Good afternoon, Alexis, he said in English. I think we may now regard this interesting episode as closed. I take it that you surrender. Saskia, dear, you are coming with me on a little journey. Will you tell my men where to find your baggage? The reply was in Russian. Alexis' voice was as cool as the others, and it seemed to wake him to anger. He replied in a rapid torrent of words, and appealed to the men below, who shouted back. The flare was dying down, and shadows again hid most of the hall. Dougal crept up behind Sir Archie. Here, I think it's the police. They're whistling out by, and I hear folk crying to each other, know the foreigners. Again Alexis spoke, and then Saskia joined in. What she said rang sharp with contempt, and her fingers played with her little pistol. Suddenly before the young man could answer Dobson bustled towards him. The innkeeper was laboring under some strong emotion, for he seemed to be pleading and pointing urgently towards the door. "I tell ye it's the police," whispered Dougal. "They're nick it." There was a swaying in the crowd and anxious faces. Men surged in, whispered and went out, and a clamour arose which the leader stilled with a fierce gesture. "You there," he cried, looking up, "you English. We mean you no ill, but I require you to hand over to me the lady and the Russian who is with her. I give you a minute by my watch to decide. If you refuse, my men are behind you and around you, and you go with me to be punished at my leisure." "I warn you," cried Sir Archie. "We are armed, and will shoot down anyone who dares to lay a hand on us." "You fool," came the answer. "I can send you all to eternity before you touch a trigger." Leon was by his side now, Leon and Spidel, imploring him to do something which he angrily refused. Outside there was a new clamour, faces showing at the door and then vanishing, and an anxious hum filled the hall. Dobson appeared again, and this time he was a figure of fury. "Are ye daft, man?" he cried. "I tell ye the police are closin' round us, and there's no a moment to lose if we would get back to the boats. If ye'll no think o' your own neck, I'm thinking o' mine. The whole thing's a bloody misfire. Come on, lads, if ye re no besotted on destruction." Leon laid a hand on the leader's arm and was roughly shaken off. Spidel fared no better, and the little group on the upper landing saw the two shrug their shoulders and make for the door. The hall was emptying fast, and the watchers had gone from the back stairs. The young man's voice rose to a scream. He commanded, threatened, cursed, but panic was in the air and he had lost his mastery. "Quick," croaked Dougal, "now's the time for the counter-attack." But the figure on the stairs held them motionless. They could not see his face, but by instinct they knew that it was distraught with fury and defeat. The flare blazed up again as the flame caught a knot of fresh powder, and once more the place was bright with the uncanny light. The hall was empty save for the pale man who was in the act of turning. He looked back. "If I go now, I will return. The world is not wide enough to hide you from me, Saskia." "You will never get her," said Alexis. A sudden devil flamed into his eyes, the devil of some ancestral savagery, which would destroy what is desired but unattainable. He swung round, his hand went to his pocket, something clicked, and his arm shot out like a baseball pitcher's. So intent was the gaze of the others on him, that they did not see a second figure ascending the stairs. Just as Alexis flung himself before the princess, the newcomer caught the young man's outstretched arm and wrenched something from his hand. The next second he had hurled it into a far corner where stood the great fireplace. There was a blinding sheet of flame, a dull roar, and then billow upon billow of acrid smoke. As it cleared they saw that the fine Italian chimneypiece, the pride of the builder of the house, was a mass of splinters, and that a great hole had been blown through the wall into what had been the dining room. A figure was sitting on the bottom step feeling its bruises. The last enemy had gone. When Mr. John Heritage raised his eyes he saw the princess with a very pale face in the arms of a tall man whom he had never seen before. If he was surprised at the sight, he did not show it. Nasty little bomb that. Time fuse. I remember we struck the brand first in July 18. Are they rounded up? Sir Archie asked. They've bolted. Whether they'll get away is another matter. I left half the mounted police a minute ago at the top of the West Lodge Avenue. The other lot went to the Garplefoot to cut off the boats. Good Lord, man, Sir Archie cried, the police have been here for the last 10 minutes. You're wrong. They came with me. Then what on earth, began the astonished baronet. He stopped short, for he suddenly got his answer. Into the hall from the veranda limped a boy. Never was there seen so ruinous a child. He was dripping wet, his shirt was all but torn off his back, his bleeding nose was poorly stanched by a wisp of handkerchief, his breeches were in ribbons, and his poor bare legs looked as if they had been comprehensively kicked and scratched. Limpingly he entered, yet with a kind of pride, like some small sparrow who has lost most of his plumage but has vanquished his adversary. With a yell Dougal went down the stairs. The boy saluted him, and they gravely shook hands. It was the meeting of Wellington and Blücher. The chieftain's voice shrilled in triumph, but there was a break in it. The glory was almost too great to be borne. "I kenned it," he cried. "It was the Gorbals diehards. There stands the man that done it. Ye'll know fickle Thomas Yawney." Chapter 15. The Gorbals diehards go into action. We left Mr. McCunn, full of aches but desperately resolute in spirit, hobbling by the Auchenlacan road into the village of Doutcarter. His goal was Mrs. Moran's hen house, which was Thomas Yawney's poste de commandement. The rain had come on again, and, though in other weather there would have been a slow twilight, already the shadow of night had the world in its grip. The sea even from the high ground was invisible, and all to westward and windward was a ragged screen of dark cloud. It was foul weather for foul deeds. Thomas Yawney was not in the hen house, but in Mrs. Moran's kitchen, and with him were the pug-faced boy known as Old Bill, and the sturdy figure of Peter Patterson. But the floor was held by the hostess. She still wore her big boots, her petticoats were still kilted, and round her venerable head in lieu of a bonnet was drawn a tartan shawl. Dickson, but I'm blithe to see ye. And, pure man, ye've been sair mishandled. This is the awfullest Sabbath day that ever you and me pit in. I hope it'll be forgiven us. Was the young leddy? Dougal was saying she was in the house with Sir Archibald and the men from the Mains. Ways me. Mrs. Moran keened. And what kind o' place is yon for her? They laddies tell me there's boatfuls o' scoundrels landed at the Garple Fit. They'll try the old tower, but they'll no wait there when they find it too, and they'll be inside the hoose in a jiffy and a word wi' the pure lassie. Sirs, it mauna be. Ye lippen into the polis, but in a my days I never kenned the polis in time. We maun be up and dane ourselves. Oh, if I could get a hordo that red-hided Dougal. As she spoke, there came on the wind the dull reverberation of an explosion. "Keep us, what's that?" she cried. "It's dynamite," said Peter Patterson. "That's the end o' the old tower," observed Thomas Yawney in his quiet even voice. "And it's likely the end o' the man heritage." "Lord pity us," the old woman wailed. "And us standing here like stickies and no lift in a hand. Awa ye, laddies, and day something. Awa you too, Dickson, or I'll tack the road missile dot." "I've got orders," said the chief of staff, "no to move till the situation's clear. Napoleon's up at the tower and Jakey in the policies. I maun wait on their reports." For a moment Mrs. Moran's attention was distracted by Dickson, who suddenly felt very faint and sat down heavily on a kitchen chair. "Man, ye're as white as a dish clout," she exclaimed with compunction. "Ye're fair wore out, and ye'll have had nae meat sin your breakfast. See, and I'll get ye a cup o' tea." She proved to be in the right, for as soon as Dickson had swallowed some mouthfuls of her strong scalding brew the colour came back to his cheeks, and he announced that he felt better. "Ye'll fortify it wi' a dram," she told him, and produced a black bottle from her cupboard. "My father I said that gid whiskey and het keep it the doctor's gigoot o' the clothes." The back door opened and Napoleon entered, his thin shanks blue with cold. He saluted and made his report in a voice shrill with excitement. "The tower has fallen. They've blown in the big door, and the feck o' them's inside." "And Mr. Heritage?" was Dickson's anxious inquiry. "When I last saw him he was up at a windy shoot-in. I think he's gotten onto the roof. I wouldna wonder but the place is on fire." "Here, this is awful," Dickson groaned. "We can't let Mr. Heritage be killed that way. What strength is the enemy? I counted 27, and there's stragglers coming up from the boats. And there's me and you 5 laddies here, and Dougal and the others shut up in the house. He stopped in sheer despair. It was a fix from which the most enlightened business mind showed no escape. Prudence, inventiveness were no longer in question, only some desperate course of violence. We must create a diversion, he said. I'm for the tower, and you laddies must come with me. We'll maybe see a chance. Oh, but I wish I had my wee pistol. If ye gone there, Dickson, I'm coming wye, Mrs. Moran announced. Her words revealed to Dickson the preposterousness of the whole situation, and for all his anxiety he laughed. 5 laddies, a middle-aged man and an old wife, he cried. DOD, it's pretty hopeless. It's like the thing in the Bible about the weak things of the world trying to confound the strong. The Bible's wiles-riched, Mrs. Moran answered dryly. Come on, for there's no time to lose. The door opened again to admit the figure of wee Jakey. There were no tears in his eyes, and his face was very white. They are round the hoose, he croaked. I was up a tree fornint the verandy and seen them. The lassie ran out and cried on them from the top o' the brae, and they turned and hunted her back. Gosh, but it was a near thing. I seen the captain sklim in the wall, and a muckle man took the lassie and flung her up the ladder. They got inside just in time and steek at the door, and now the whole pack is roaring round the hoose seeking a road in. They'll no be long over the job, neither. What about Mr. Heritage? They're no heedin' about him any more. The old tower's bleezin' dot. Worse and worse, said Dickson. If the police don't come in the next 10 minutes, they'll be away with the princess. They've beaten all Dougal's plans, and it's a straight fight with odds of 6 to 1. It's not possible. Mrs. Moran for the first time seemed to lose hope. The pure lassie, she wailed, and sinking on a chair covered her face with her shawl. Laddies, can you no think of a plan? Asked Dickson, his voice flat with despair. Then Thomas Yawney spoke. So far he had been silent, but under his tangled thatch of hair, his mind had been busy. Jakey's report seemed to bring him to a decision. It's dark, he said, and it's gettin' darker. There was that in his voice which promised something, and Dickson listened. The enemy's mostly foreigners, but Dobson's there and I think he's a kind of guide to them. Dobson's feared of the police, and if we can terrify Dobson he'll terrify the rest. But where are the police? They're no here yet, but they're coming. The fear o' them is in Dobson's mind. If he thinks the police has arrived, he'll put the wind up the lot. We maun be the police. Dickson could only stare while the chief of staff unfolded his scheme. I do not know to whom the muse of history will give the credit of the tactics of infiltration, whether to Ludendorff or von Hutier or some other proud captain of Germany, or to Foch, who revised and perfected them. But I know that the same notion was at this moment of crisis conceived by Thomas Yawney, whom no parents acknowledged, who slept usually in a coal cellar, and who had picked up his education among Gorbals closes and along the wharves of Clyde. It's getting dark, he said, and the enemy are that busy trying to break into the hoose that they'll no be thinking o' their rear. The 5 o' us died hearts is grand at dodgin' and keeping out of sight, and what hinders us to get in among them, so that they'll hear us but never see us? We're used to the ways o' the police, and can imitate them fine. Forby we've all got our whistles, which are the same as a bobby's bell, and old Bill and Peter are grand at copyin' a man's voice. Since the captain is shut up in the hoose, the command falls to me, and that's my plan. With a piece of chalk he drew on the kitchen floor a rough sketch of the environs of Huntington. Peter Patterson was to move from the shrubberies beyond the veranda, Napoleon from the stables, old Bill from the tower, while wee Jakey and Thomas himself were to advance as if from the Garplefoot, so that the enemy might fear for his communications. As soon as one o' ye gets into position his to gie the patrol cry, and when each o' ye has heard 5 cries, his to advance. Begin bailin' and roarin' afore ye get among them, and keep it up till ye re at the who's wall. If they've gotten inside, in ye go after them. I trust each die hard to use his judgment, and above all to keep out o' sight and no let him sail be grip pit. The plan, like all great tactics, was simple, and no sooner was it expounded than it was put into action. The die-hards faded out of the kitchen like fog wreaths, and Dickson and Mrs. Moran were left looking at each other. They did not look long. The bare feet of wee Jakey had not crossed the threshold 50 seconds, before they were followed by Mrs. Moran's out-of-doors boots and Dickson's tackets. Arm in arm the two hobbled down the back path behind the village which led to the South Lodge. The gate was unlocked, for the warder was busy elsewhere, and they hastened up the avenue. Far off Dickson thought he saw shapes fleeting across the park, which he took to be the shock troops of his own side, and he seemed to hear snatches of song. Jakey was giving tongue, and this was what he sang. Proletarians, arise! Wave the red flag to the skies. Heed nae mair the fat man's lees. Stab them down his throat. Knock to loss accept our chains. We mourn drain all dearest veins. The world shall be our gains. But he tripped over a rabbit wire and thereafter conserved his breath. The wind was so loud that no sound reached them from the house, which blank and immense now loomed before them. Dickson's ears were alert for the noise of shots or the dull crash of bombs. Hearing nothing, he feared the worst, and hurried Mrs. Moran at a pace which endangered her life. He had no fear for himself, arguing that his foes were seeking higher game, and judging, too, that the main battle must be round the veranda at the other end. The two passed the shrubbery where the road forked, one path running to the back door and one to the stables. They took the latter and presently came out on the downs, with the ravine of the Garple on their left, the stables in front, and on the right the hollow of a formal garden running along the west side of the house. The gale was so fierce, now that they had no wind break between them and the ocean, that Mrs. Moran could wrestle with it no longer, and found shelter in the lee of a clump of rhododendrons. Darkness had all but fallen, and the house was a black shadow against the dusky sky, while a confused greyness marked the sea. The old tower showed a tooth of masonry. There was no glow from it, so the fire, which Jakey had reported, must have died down. A warp cried loudly, and very eerily, then another. The birds stirred up Mrs. Moran. "That's the laddies' patrol," she gasped. "Count the cries, Dickson." Another bird wailed, this time very near. Then there was perhaps 3 minutes' silence, till a fainter weeple came from the direction of the tower. "4," said Dickson, but he waited in vain on the 5th. He had not the acute hearing of the boys, and could not catch the faint echo of Peter Patterson's signal beyond the veranda. The next he heard was a shrill whistle cutting into the wind, and then others in rapid succession from different quarters, and something which might have been the hoarse shouting of angry men. The Gorbals' die-hards had gone into action. Dull prose is no medium to tell of that wild adventure. The sober sequence of the military historian is out of place in recording deeds that knew not sequence or sobriety. Were I a bard, I would cast this tale in excited verse, with a lilt which would catch the speed of the reality. I would sing of Napoleon, not unworthy of his great namesake, who penetrated to the very window of the lady's bedroom, where the framework had been driven in and men were pouring through, of how there he made such pandemonium with his whistle that men tumbled back and ran about blindly seeking for guidance, of how in the long run his pugnacity mastered him, so that he engaged in combat with an unknown figure and the two rolled into what had once been a fountain. I would hymn Peter Patterson, who across tracts of darkness engaged Old Bill in a conversation which would have done no discredit to a Gallowgate policeman. He pretended to be making reports and seeking orders. "We've gotten 3 o' the devils, sir." "What'll we day w o' them?" he shouted, and back would come the reply in a slightly more genteel voice, fall them to the rear. Tamson has charge of the prisoners. Or it would be, they've gotten pistols, sir. What's the orders? And the answer would be, stick to your battens. The guns are posted on the now, so we needn't hurry. And over all the din there would be a perpetual whistling and a yelling of hands up. I would sing, too, of wee Jakey, who was having the red letter hour of his life. His fragile form moved like a lizard in places where no mortal could be expected, and he varied his duties with impish assaults upon the persons of such as came in his way. His whistle blew in a man's ear 1 second and the next yards away. Sometimes he was moved to song, and unearthly fragments of class, conscious we are all proletarians, arise, mingled with the din, like the cry of seagulls in a storm. He saw a bright light flare up within the house which warned him not to enter, but he got as far as the garden room, in whose dark corners he made havoc. Indeed, he was almost too successful, for he created panic where he went, and 1 or 2 fired blindly at the quarter where he had last been heard. These shots were followed by frenzied prohibitions from Spidle and were not repeated. Presently he felt that aimless surge of men that is the prelude to flight, and heard Dobson's great voice roaring in the hall. Convinced that the crisis had come, he made his way outside, prepared to harass the rear of any retirement. Tears now flowed down his face, and he could not have spoken for sobs, but he had never been so happy. But chiefly would I celebrate Thomas Yaunai, for it was he who brought fear into the heart of Dobson. He had a voice of singular compass, and from the veranda he made it echo round the house. The efforts of Old Bill and Peter Patterson had been skillful indeed, but those of Thomas Yaunai were deadly. To some leader beyond he shouted news, Robison's just about finished wi his lot, and then he'll get the boats. A furious charge upset him, and for a moment he thought he had been discovered. But it was only Dobson rushing to Leon, who was leading the men in the doorway. Thomas fled to the far end of the veranda, and again lifted up his voice. All foreigners, he shouted, except the man Dobson. Eh? You've got Loudon? Well done. It must have been this last performance which broke Dobson's nerve and convinced him that the one hope lay in a rapid retreat to the Garplefoot. There was a tumbling of men in the doorway, a muttering of strange tongues, and the vision of the innkeeper shouting to Leon and Spidle. For a second he was seen in the faint reflection that the light in the hall cast as far as the veranda, a wild figure urging the retreat with a pistol clap to the head of those who were too confused by the hurricane of events to grasp the situation. Some of them dropped over the wall, but most huddled like sheep through the door on the west side, a jumble of struggling, panic-stricken mortality. Thomas Yaunai, staggered at the success of his tactics, yet kept his head and did his utmost to confuse the retreat, and the triumphant shouts and whistles of the other die-hards showed that they were not unmindful of this final duty. The veranda was empty, and he was just about to enter the house, when through the west door came a figure, breathing hard and bent apparently on the same errand. Thomas prepared for battle, determined that no straggler of the enemy should now wrest from him victory, but, as the figure came into the faint glow at the doorway, he recognized it as Heritage. And at the same moment he heard something which made his tense nerves relax. Away on the right came sounds, a thud of galloping horses on grass and the jingle of bridle reins and the voices of men. It was the real thing at last. It is a sad commentary on his career, but now for the first time in his brief existence Thomas Yaunai felt charitably disposed towards the police. The poet, since we left him blaspheming on the roof of the tower, had been having a crowded hour of most inglorious life. He had started to descend at a furious pace, and his first misadventure was that he stumbled and dropped Dickson's pistol over the parapet. He tried to mark where it might have fallen in the gloom below, and this lost him precious minutes. When he slithered through the trap into the attic room, where he had tried to hold up the attack, he discovered that it was full of smoke which sought in vain to escape by the narrow window. Volumes of it were pouring up the stairs, and when he attempted to descend he found himself choked and blinded. He rushed gasping to the window, filled his lungs with fresh air, and tried again, but he got no further than the first turn, from which he could see through the cloud-red tongues of flame in the ground room. This was solemn indeed, so he sought another way out. He got on the roof, for he remembered a chimney stack, cloaked with ivy, which was built straight from the ground, and he thought he might climb down it. He found the chimney and began the descent, confidently, for he had once borne a good reputation at the Montanvert and Cortina. At first all went well, for stones stuck out at decent intervals like the rungs of a ladder, and roots of ivy supplemented their deficiencies. But presently he came to a place where the masonry had crumbled into a cave, and left a gap some 20 feet high. Below it he could dimly see a thick mass of ivy which would enable him to cover the further 40 feet to the ground, but at that cave he stuck most finally. All round the lime and stone had lapsed into debris, and he could find no safe foothold. Worse still, the block on which he relied proved loose, and only by a dangerous traverse did he avert disaster. There he hung for a minute or two, with a cold void in his stomach. He had always distrusted the handiwork of man as a place to scramble on, and now he was planted in the dark on a decomposing wall, with an excellent chance of breaking his neck, and with the most urgent need for haste. He could see the windows of the house and, since he was sheltered from the gale, he could hear the faint sound of blows on woodwork. There was clearly the devil to pay there, and yet here he was helplessly stuck. Setting his teeth, he started to ascend again. Better the fire than this cold breakneck emptiness. It took him the better part of half an hour to get back, and he passed through many moments of acute fear. Footholds which had seemed secure enough in the descent now proved impossible, and more than once he had his heart in his mouth when a rotten ivy stump or a wedge of stone gave in his hands, and dropped dully into the pit of night, leaving him crazily spread-eagled. When at last he reached the top he rolled on his back and felt very sick. Then, as he realized his safety, his impatience revived. At all costs he would force his way out though he should be grilled like a herring. The smoke was less thick in the attic, and with his handkerchief wet with the rain and bound across his mouth he made a dash for the ground room. It was as hot as a furnace, for everything inflammable in it seemed to have caught fire, and the lumber glowed in piles of hot ashes. But the floor and walls were stone, and only the blazing jambs of the door stood between him and the outer air. He had burned himself considerably as he stumbled downwards, and the pain drove him to a wild leap through the broken arch, where he miscalculated the distance, charred his shins, and brought down a red, hot fragment of the lintel on his head. But the thing was done, and a minute later he was rolling like a dog in the wet bracken to cool his burns and put out various smouldering patches on his raiment. Then he started running for the house, but, confused by the darkness, he bore too much to the north, and came out in the side avenue from which he and Dickson had reconnoitred on the first evening. He saw on the right a glow in the veranda which, as we know, was the reflection of the flare in the hall, and he heard a babble of voices. But he heard something more, for away on his left was the sound which Thomas Yaunai was soon to hear, the trampling of horses. It was the police at last, and his task was to guide them at once to the critical point of action. 3 minutes later a figure like a scarecrow was admonishing a bewildered sergeant, while his hands plucked feverishly at a horse's bridle. It is time to return to Dickson in his clump of rhododendrons. Tragically aware of his impotence he listened to the tumult of the die-hards, hopeful when it was loud, despairing when there came a moment's lull, while Mrs. Moran like a Greek chorus drew loudly upon her store of proverbial philosophy and her memory of scripture texts. Twice he tried to reconnoitre towards the scene of battle, but only blundered into sunken plots and pits in the Dutch garden. Finally he squatted beside Mrs. Moran, lit his pipe, and took a firm hold on his patience. It was not tested for long. Presently he was aware that a change had come over the scene, that the die-hards' whistles and shouts were being drowned in another sound, the cries of panicky men. Dobson's bellow was wafted to him. "Auntie Femi," he shouted, "the innkeeper's getting rattled. DOD, I believe they're running." For at that moment 20 paces on his left the van of the retreat crashed through the creepers on the garden's edge and leaped the wall that separated it from the cliffs of the Garpelfoot. The old woman was on her feet. God be than kit, is t the polis? Maybe. Maybe no. But they're running. Another bunch of men raced past, and he heard Dobson's voice. I tell you, they're broke. Listen, it's horses. It's the police, but it was the die-hards that did the job. Here. They mustn't escape. Have the police had the sense to send men to the Garplefoot? Mrs. Moran, a figure like an ancient prophetess, with her tartan shawl lashing in the gale, clutched him by the shoulder. Down to the waterside and stop them. Ye'll no be beat by we laddies. On wie and I'll follow. There's going to be a judgment on evil, Jules this nisht. Dickson needed no urging. His heart was hot within him, and the weariness and stiffness had gone from his limbs. He, too, tumbled over the wall, and made for what he thought was the route by which he had originally ascended from the stream. As he ran he made ridiculous efforts to cry like a warp in the hope of summoning the die-hards. Indeed, he found Napoleon, who had suffered a grievous pounding in the fountain and had only escaped by an eel-like agility which had aforetime served him in good stead with the law of his native city. Lucky for Dickson was the meeting, for he had forgotten the road and would certainly have broken his neck. Led by the die-hard he slid 40 feet over screes and boiler plates, with the gale plucking at him, found a path, lost it, and then tumbled down a raw bank of earth to the flat ground beside the harbour. During all this performance, he has told me, he had no thought of fear, nor any clear notion what he meant to do. He just wanted to be in at the finish of the job. Through the narrow entrance the gale blew as through a funnel, and the usually placid waters of the harbour were a mass of angry waves. 2 boats had been launched and were plunging furiously, and on one of them a lantern dipped and fell. By its light he could see men holding a further boat by the shore. There was no sign of the police. He reflected that probably they had become tangled in the Garpledine. The 3rd boat was waiting for someone. Dickson, a new Ajax by the ships, divined who this someone must be and realized his duty. It was the leader, the arch-enemy, the man whose escape must at all costs be stopped. Perhaps he had the princess with him, thus snatching victory from apparent defeat. In any case he must be tackled, and a fierce anxiety gripped his heart. I finish a job, he told himself, and peered up into the darkness of the cliffs, wondering just how he should set about it, for except in the last few days he had never engaged in combat with a fellow creature. When he comes, you grip his legs, he told Napoleon, and get him down. He'll have a pistol, and we're done if he's on his feet. There was a cry from the boats, a shout of guidance, and the light on the water was waved madly. They must have good eyesight, thought Dickson, for he could see nothing. And then suddenly he was aware of steps in front of him, and a shape like a man rising out of the void at his left hand. In the darkness Napoleon missed his tackle, and the full shock came on Dickson. He aimed at what he thought was the enemy's throat, found only an arm and was shaken off as a mastiff might shake off a toy terrier. He made another clutch, fell, and in falling caught his opponent's leg so that he brought him down. The man was immensely agile, for he was up in a second and something hot and bright blew into Dickson's face. The pistol bullet had passed through the collar of his faithful waterproof, slightly singeing his neck. But it served its purpose, for Dickson paused, gasping, to consider where he had been hit, and before he could resume the chase the last boat had pushed off into deep water. To be shot at from close quarters is always irritating, and the novelty of the experience increased Dickson's natural wrath. He fumed on the shore like a deerhound when the stag has taken to the sea. So hot was his blood that he would have cheerfully assaulted the whole crew had they been within his reach. Napoleon, who had been incapacitated for speed by having his stomach and bare shank savagely trampled upon, joined him, and together they watched the bobbing black specks as they crawled out of the estuary into the grey spindrift which marked the harbour mouth. But as he looked the wrath died out of Dickson's soul. For he saw that the boats had indeed sailed on a desperate venture, and that a pursuer was on their track more potent than his breathless middle age. The tide was on the ebb, and the gale was driving the Atlantic breakers shoreward, and in the jaws of the entrance the two waters met in an unearthly turmoil. Above the noise of the wind came the roar of the flooded Garple and the fret of the harbour, and far beyond all the crashing thunder of the conflict at the harbour mouth. Even in the darkness, against the still faintly grey western sky, the spume could be seen rising like waterspouts. But it was the ear rather than the eye which made certain presage of disaster. No boat could face the challenge of that loud portal. As Dickson struggled against the wind and stared, his heart melted and a great awe fell upon him. He may have wept, it is certain that he prayed. Poor souls, he repeated. I doubt the last hour or two has been a poor preparation for eternity. The tide next day brought the dead ashore. Among them was a young man, different in dress and appearance from the rest, a young man with a noble head and a finely cut classic face, which was not marred like the others from pounding among the Garple rocks. His dark hair was washed back from his brow, and the mouth, which had been hard in life, was now relaxed in the strange innocence of death. Dickson gazed at the body and observed that there was a slight deformation between the shoulders. Poor fellow, he said. That explains a lot. As my father used to say, cripples have a right to be cankered. Chapter 16. In which a princess leaves a dark tower and a provision merchant returns to his family. The 3 days of storm ended in the night, and with the wild weather there departed from the crewives something which had weighed on Dickson's spirit since he first saw the place. Monday, only a week from the morning when he had conceived his plan of holiday, saw the return of the sun and the bland airs of spring. Beyond the blue of the yet restless waters rose dim mountains tipped with snow, like some Mediterranean seascape. Nesting birds were busy on the lava banks and in the Huntington thickets, the village smoked peacefully to the clear skies, even the house looked cheerful if dishevelled. The Garple Dean was a garden of swaying larches, linnets, and wild anemones. Assuredly, thought Dickson, there had come a mighty change in the countryside, and he meditated a future discourse to the Literary Society of the Guthrie Memorial Kirk on natural beauty in relation to the mind of man. It remains for the chronicler to gather up the loose ends of his tale. There was no newspaper story with bold headlines of this the most recent assault on the shores of Britain. Alexis Nikolaevich, once a Prince of Muscovy and now Mr. Alexander Nicholson of the rising firm of Sprott and Nicholson of Melbourne, had interest enough to prevent it. For it was clear that if Saskia was to be saved from persecution, her enemies must disappear without trace from the world, and no story be told of the wild venture which was their undoing. The constabulary of Carrick and Scotland Yard were indisposed to ask questions, under a hint from their superiors, the more so as no serious damage had been done to the persons of His Majesty's lieges, and no lives had been lost except by the violence of nature. The procurator fiscal investigated the case of the drowned men, and reported that so many foreign sailors, names and origins unknown, had perished in attempting to return to their ship at the Garple Foot. The Danish brig had vanished into the mist of the northern seas. But one signal calamity the procurator fiscal had to record. The body of Loudon the factor was found on the Monday morning below the cliffs, his neck broken by a fall. In the darkness and confusion he must have tried to escape in that direction, and he had chosen an impracticable road or had slipped on the edge. It was returned as death by misadventure, and the Carrick Herald and the Auchenlacan Advertiser excelled themselves in eulogy. Mr. Loudon, they said, had been widely known in the south, west of Scotland as an able and trusted lawyer, an assiduous public servant, and not least as a good sportsman. It was the last trait which had led to his death, for, in his enthusiasm for wild nature, he had been studying bird life on the cliffs of the Crewives during the storm, and had made that fatal slip which had deprived the shire of a wise counsellor and the best of good fellows. The tinklers of the Garple Foot took themselves off, and where they may now be pursuing their devious courses is unknown to the chronicler. Dobson, too, disappeared, for he was not among the dead from the boats. He knew the neighbourhood and probably made his way to some port from which he took passage to one or other of those foreign lands which had formerly been honoured by his patronage. nor did all the Russians perish. 3 were found skulking next morning in the woods, starving and ignorant of any tongue but their own, and 5 more came ashore much battered but alive. Alexis took charge of the 8 survivors, and arranged to pay their passage to one of the British dominions and to give them a start in a new life. They were broken creatures, with the dazed look of lost animals, and 4 of them had been peasants on Saskia's estates. Alexis spoke to them in their own language. "In my grandfather's time," he said, "you were serfs. Then there came a change, and for some time you were free men. Now you have slipped back into being slaves again, the worst of slaveries, for you have been the serfs of fools and scoundrels and the black passion of your own hearts. I give you a chance of becoming free men once more. You have the task before you of working out your own salvation. Go, and God be with you." Before we take leave of these companions of a single week, I would present them to you again as they appeared on a certain sunny afternoon when the episode of Huntington was on the eve of closing. First we see Saskia and Alexis walking on the thymy sward of the cliff top, looking out to the fretted blue of the sea. It is a fitting place for lovers, above all for lovers who have turned the page on a dark preface, and have before them still the long bright volume of life. The girl has her arm linked with the man's, but as they walk she breaks off and away from him, to dart into copses, to gather flowers, or to peer over the brink where the gulls will and oyster catchers pipe among the shingle. She is no more the tragic muse of the past week, but a laughing child again, full of snatches of song, her eyes bright with expectation. They talk of the new world which lies before them, and her voice is happy. Then her brows contract, and, as she flings herself down on a patch of young heather, her air is thoughtful. "I have been back among fairy tales," she says. "I do not quite understand, Alicia. Those gallant little boys. They are youth, and youth is always full of strangeness. Mr. Heritage. He is youth, too, and poetry, perhaps, and a soldier's tradition. I think I know him. But what about Dickson? He is the petit bourgeois, the épicier, the class which the world ridicules. He is unbelievable. The others with good fortune I might find elsewhere, in Russia perhaps. But not Dickson." "No," is the answer. "You will not find him in Russia. He is what we call the middle class, which we who are foolish used to laugh at. But he is the stuff which above all others makes a great people. He will endure when aristocracies crack and proletariats crumble. In our own land we have never known him, but till we create him our land will not be a nation." Half a mile away on the edge of the lava glen Dickson and Heritage are together, Dickson placidly smoking on a tree stump and Heritage walking excitedly about and cutting with his stick at the bracken. Sundry bandages and strips of sticking plaster still adorn the poet, but his clothes have been tidied up by Mrs. Moran, and he has recovered something of his old precision of garb. The eyes of both are fixed on the 2 figures on the cliff atop. Dickson feels acutely uneasy. It is the first time that he has been alone with Heritage since the arrival of Alexis shivered the poet's dream. He looks to see a tragic grief. To his amazement he beholds something very like exultation. "The trouble about you, dog son," says Heritage, "is that you're a bit of an anarchist. All you false romantics are. You don't see the extraordinary beauty of the conventions which time has consecrated. You always want novelty, you know, and the novel is usually the ugly and rarely the true. I am for romance, but upon the old, noble classic lines." Dickson is scarcely listening. His eyes are on the distant lovers and he longs to say something which will gently and graciously express his sympathy with his friend. "I'm afraid," he begins hesitatingly, "I'm afraid you've had a bad blow, Mr. Heritage. You're taking it awful well, and I honor you for it." The poet flings back his head. "I am reconciled," he says. "After all, 'tis better to have loved and lost, than never to have loved at all. It has been a great experience and has shown me my own heart. I love her, I shall always love her, but I realize that she was never meant for me. Thank God I've been able to serve her, that is all a moth can ask of a star. I'm a better man for it, dog son. She will be a glorious memory, and Lord, what poetry I shall write! I give her up joyfully, for she has found her true mate. Let us not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. The thing's too perfect to grieve about. Look! There is romance incarnate. He points to the figures now silhouetted against the further sea. How does it go, dog son? He cries. And on her lover's arm she leant, what next? You know the thing. Dickson assists and Heritage declaims. And on her lover's arm she leant. And round her waist she felt it fold. And far across the hills they went. In that new world which is the old. Across the hills, and far away. Beyond their utmost purple rim. And deep into the dying day. The happy princess followed him. He repeats the last two lines twice and draws a deep breath. How right, he cries. How absolutely right. Lord! It's astonishing how that old bird Tennyson got the goods. After that Dickson leaves him and wanders among the thickets on the edge of the Huntington policies above the lava glen. He feels childishly happy, wonderfully young, and at the same time supernaturally wise. Sometimes he thinks the past week has been a dream, till he touches the sticking plaster on his brow, and finds that his left thigh is still a mass of bruises and that his right leg is woefully stiff. With that the past becomes very real again, and he sees the Garpledine in that stormy afternoon. He wrestles again at midnight in the dark house, he stands with quaking heart by the boats to cut off the retreat. He sees it all, but without terror in the recollection, rather with gusto and a modest pride. I've surely had a remarkable time, he tells himself, and then romance, the goddess whom he has worshipped so long, marries that furious week with the idyllic. He is supremely content, for he knows that in his humble way he has not been found wanting. Once more for him the Chavender or Chub, and long dreams among summer hills. His mind flies to the days ahead of him, when he will go wandering with his pack in many green places. Happy days they will be, the prospect with which he has always charmed his mind. Yes, but they will be different from what he had fancied, for he is another man than the complacent little fellow who set out a week ago on his travels. He has now assurance of himself, assurance of his faith. Romance, he sees, is one and indivisible. Below him by the edge of the stream he sees the encampment of the Gorbals die hards. He calls and waves a hand, and his signal is answered. It seems to be washing day, for some scanty and tattered raiment is drying on the sward. The band is evidently in session, for it is sitting in a circle, deep in talk. As he looks at the ancient tents, the humble equipment, the ring of small shockheads, a great tenderness comes over him. The die-hards are so tiny, so poor, so pitifully handicapped, and yet so bold in their meagerness. Not one of them has had anything that might be called a chance. Their few years have been spent in kennels and closes, always hungry and hunted, with none to care for them. Their childish ears have been habituated to every coarseness, their small minds filled with the desperate shifts of living. And yet, what a heavenly spark was in them! He had always thought nobly of the soul, now he wants to get on his knees before the queer greatness of humanity. A figure disengages itself from the group, and Dougal makes his way up the hill towards him. The chieftain is not more reputable in garb than when we first saw him, nor is he more cheerful of countenance. He has one arm in a sling made out of his neckerchief, and his scraggy little throat rises bare from his voluminous shirt. All that can be said for him is that he is appreciably cleaner. He comes to a standstill and salutes with a special formality. Dougal, says Dickson, I've been thinking. You're the grandest lot of wee laddies I ever heard tell of, and, forby, you've saved my life. Now, I'm getting on in years, though you'll admit that I'm not that dead old, and I'm not a poor man, and I haven't chick or child to look after. None of you has ever had a proper chance or been right fed or educated or taken care of. I've just the one thing to say to you. From now on you're my bairns, every one of you. You're fine laddies, and I'm going to see that you turn into fine men. There's the stuff in you to make generals and provosts, and prime ministers, and DOD. It'll not be my blame if it doesn't get out. Dougal listens gravely and again salutes. I've brought ye a message, he says. We've just had a meeting and I've to report that you've been unanimously elected Chief Dive Hard. We're hoping you'll accept. I accept, Dickson replies. Proudly and gratefully I accept. The last scene is some days later, in a certain southern suburb of Glasgow. Ulysses has come back to Ithaca, and is sitting by his fireside, waiting on the return of Penelope from the nuke hydropathic. There is a chill in the air, so a fire is burning in the grate, but the laden tea table is bright with the first blooms of lilac. Dickson, in a new suit with a flower in his buttonhole, looks none the worse for his travels, save that there is still sticking plaster on his deeply sunburnt brow. He waits impatiently with his eye on the black marble timepiece, and he fingers something in his pocket. Presently the sound of wheels is heard, and the peahen voice of Tibby announces the arrival of Penelope. Dickson rushes to the door and at the threshold welcomes his wife with a resounding kiss. He leads her into the parlor and settles her in her own chair. My! But it's nice to be home again, she says. And everything that comfortable. I've had a fine time, but there's no place like your own fireside. You're looking awful well, Dickson. But Losh! What have you been doing to your head? Just a small tumble. It's very near mended already. I've had a grand walking tour, but the weather was a wee bit thrawn. It's nice to see you back again, Mama. Now that I'm an idle man, you and me must take a lot of jaunts together. She beams on him as she stays herself with Tibby scones, and when the meal is ended, Dickson draws from his pocket a slim case. The jewels have been restored to Saskia, but this is one of her own which she has bestowed upon Dickson as a parting memento. He opens the case and reveals a necklet of emeralds, any one of which is worth half the street. This is a present for you, he says bashfully. Mrs. McCunn's eyes open wide. You're far too kind, she gasps. It must have cost an awful lot of money. It didn't cost me that much, is the truthful answer. She fingers the trinket and then clasps it round her neck, where the green depths of the stones glow against the black satin of her bodice. Her eyes are moist as she looks at him. You've been a kind man to me, she says, and she kisses him as she has not done since Janet's death. She stands up and admires the necklet in the mirror. Romance once more, thinks Dickson. That which has graced the slim throats of princesses in far-away courts now adorns an elderly matron in a semi-detached villa. The jewels of the wild Nausicaa have fallen to the housewife Penelope. Mrs. McCunn preens herself before the glass. I call it very genteel, she says. Real stylish. It might be worn by a queen. I wouldn't say, but it has, says Dickson. The end.